Augustus has much more time. He's the last man standing after a civil war. In a way, I see the three books. I've got Caesar, the Antony and Cleopatra, and Augustus as almost a trilogy that cover that period. Augustus turns the name Caesar and the idea of Caesar into something different. And they're almost saying, well, it comes back to this idea, well, Caesar got murdered, didn't he? Caesar crossed the Rubicon, didn't he? Whereas there's a comment that the historian Livy in a lost book praised Pompey and also questioned whether or not it was a good thing that's for the world that Caesar was born. To avoid confusion, we call Caesar's great nephew Octavian until he becomes Augustus. We avoid calling him Caesar because that would be confusing with Julius Caesar, but in fact he is Gaius Julius Caesar, son of the divine Julius. He didn't have to remind people of his connection with Julius Caesar because it's there all the time.
Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today, I am joined by Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy. He is one of the most respected historians of the ancient Roman world working today. He earned his DPhil in ancient military history from St. John's College, Oxford, and has since become a full-time author and consultant for the BBC, History Channel, and National Geographic. He's written an impressive catalog of works on Roman history, including the Punic Wars, In the Name of Rome, Augustus, First Emperor of Rome, Antony and Cleopatra, and the Fall of the West. Today, in this interview, we're going to be discussing the biography of Caesar, Life of a Colossus, which is widely regarded as one of the definitive modern biographies of Julius Caesar. Dr. Goldsworthy, welcome to MythVision.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Listen, I must admit, I got the book here on Augustus. We haven't even began to chew on this one yet, okay? Though I am fascinated with Augustus, I am fascinated with Julius Caesar and Roman history. And to give you just a bit of background before we dive into your book about Caesar, my channel has mostly focused on religious studies, and some of it has ventured into ancient Near Eastern stuff. And what really interested me, again, my introduction was two things. Finding out that the New Testament may actually have a lot more Greco-Roman stuff going on in it than we like to imagine within New Testament studies. And then the other is the series Rome. So I found your books and I said, oh my goodness, I need to listen to what he has to say about Caesar, and emailed you about doing an interview, and here you are.
Yep. No, I'm always happy to talk about the Romans. It's, as an author, you spend a lot of time on your own, but this stuff has obsessed me since I was a kid. And the more I learn, the more interesting it becomes because you keep learning as you go on. So yeah, talking about the Romans, and as I have to say, Caesar's been very good to me. I think it's my book that sold the most copies. So he's been good to me. I try to be good to him as well, but fair.
That's one of the things you say in the book, and I've got questions here, of course, already written out so that we correctly follow the script, but I may go off script because you're such a fun person to talk to that it's kind of hard not to venture off into the weeds because there's so much about this guy. Yeah. But in your book, you actually point out all of the different biographies of this guy, and a lot of them were either love or hate the guy, and you tried to lay out a raw narrative that gives you the whole picture the best you can.
I think he's a very difficult man to pin down, and anyway, it's so tempting with whatever the fashionable views are to decide this person had what we consider the right opinions about A or B or did this, therefore they're wonderful, and then we can ignore a few dodgy bits they do. Caesar is a remarkably talented individual. And when you're writing a biography of him and spending several years of your life studying these things, you can't help feeling a little bit inadequate with this guy who does so much. He even writes a textbook on grammar. It hasn't survived, but it was reasonably well thought of. Writes poetry, which wasn't thought of too well, but nevertheless writes the accounts of his campaigns, plans laws, is this successful commander. He did lots of remarkable things. I was younger than him when I was writing the thing, but he also did some terrible things. I mean, the estimate that 1 million people died during his campaigns in Gaul probably is inflated, because how would they know? But that around 1 million were enslaved, that's somewhere where you will have records, because you've turned human beings into property, and therefore you keep the records of that property as you sell them on. So terrible things happen as a result of what Caesar does. He fights a civil war, but it's like a friend of mine who also works on the Roman period once said, whatever you say about the Romans, they're never dull. So from a distance, it's a heck of a good story. And it's always something to, I mean, how many other people get stabbed to death by a group of close friends in, a meeting of your highest political body in the state? It's why one of the problems, when you showed the Augustus book, Augustus doesn't get a Shakespeare play because he dies of old age in bed. Whereas Antony kills himself, Cleopatra kills herself, Julius Caesar gets murdered. That's a lot better as a story. Again, if you're watching it and not involved in it.
Oh, gosh, there's so much there that you just said that is definitely in your audiobook in more greater detail. This guy blows me away. When I did a series a while back with guys who know the history of Joseph Smith. Now, I know this is a completely different figure, kind of guy. But, you have this like people who are thinking he's a good guy and they're apologists, let's say, in the church. And then you have those who are reading about him from the outside who think, oh, he was just a con man and he tricked people and he was into magic and all this. Well, once I got done with the series and it was painted from a secular point of view, not a defend of him, but not a antagonist through and through, and let's just knock the guy, I couldn't help but feel attached to him. And then when we approached his death, where the prison gets raided and he's being killed by all these people, there's a sense in which I didn't want that to happen. Like, I don't know if that makes sense for Caesar, but
it does. I mean, you get very attached to someone the more you're learning about them, the more detail there is in the sources, the more human they become. So when you start to find a few jokes they made, those sorts of things, and the very human details, then you grow very attached to them. You either that or you hate them if you write a biography. And I'll spend a couple of years writing a biography of one of these figures. So I'm afraid people blame me. I became far less fond of Antony when I was writing the Antony and Cleopatra book. Alexander the Great, I'm still not sure about. Caesar's one of these people that in a grudging way I like and admire, but that's partly, it was something people had at the time. He obviously had this incredible charm. And yes, there's this talent, but this man had the knack of winning people over. And you'll talk to people who've met politicians today, and there aren't many of them, but some of them have that charisma. And even their opponents will say, I went into the room wanting to argue with him or her, and I came out having donated to their campaign. And I don't know how. There was just something about them. Caesar obviously had that. Napoleon had that you don't see in a painting, let alone a sort of cold marble bust. It was clearly there, and you get a sense of it in the stories about Caesar. So to some extent, he's charming. I mean, I'm being told a few times when I gave talks about the book at universities that the more students had signed up for ancient history to follow, and everyone was saying it's the Caesar effect. It's just there's something about this man that's mesmerizing even now. But when you think how dangerous that power is, because it is a form of power, that ability to manipulate others, or even if it's not conscious, to make people agree with you, make people to go along with you. So there's a lot, as I say, it comes back to that. I don't have anything like that charm. I'm the sort of person who can put my foot in my mouth under almost any circumstances. So to write about this talented person who was also really good at getting on with people is something. But it's you do get fond of them. And my spare time as a sideline, I write novels as well. And when you invent a character and set them in part, or write about a historical character in that way, it becomes even stronger. And it's quite a danger for a biography, because what you've got to avoid is thinking, I've got Caesar in my head. I now have worked out who this man was, how he would behave. So if we get to a place in the sources where they're not very clear, we're not sure what was going on, let alone who can say what his real motives were, you then start to interpret it as, well, my Caesar would have done this, for good or bad. That's not good history. That's your imagination. That's inserting yourself, and it's very common. It's a big risk all biographers face, because you do get fond of them, or you have developed strong passions. You can end up hating somebody and always wanting them to be in the wrong. But it's it's very hard. You try to come back in the end to look at what do the sources say, to remind ourselves all the time when you're dealing with the ancient world that we have a tiny, tiny fraction of what once existed. And there's so much we cannot know. So we're having to guess. But within that guesswork, don't assume, well, this is what I think Caesar would have done, unless you make it very clear that that's just a guess. But just people will write books as if, well, I know the man or I know the woman, this is what he or she would have done. And they just assume. And it may be entertaining, but it's not history. It's not really telling you anything about anyone other than the author and their particular prejudices.
Wow. That is such a good point. I mean, coming from your perspective as an expert in this, first question I have is, what drew you to write a full biography of Caesar, and what gap did you feel existed in how his story had been told up to that point?
It's one of those things, since I was quite lucky in that I didn't have to read Caesar when I was studying Latin at school. I have no natural gift for languages whatsoever. It comes through blood, sweat, toil, and tears, and I can get there, and I get a functional knowledge. And I studied Latin and Greek and some modern languages because you need to. It's part of the job. But a lot of people, because Caesar wrote in this deceptively simple way, it was very common in British schools that you'd study him, and that meant that often people hated him and they never wanted to go back. So I came to Caesar's texts much more when I was a university student. Then when I went on to do the doctorate looking at the Roman army, Caesar has the most detailed accounts of the Roman army on operation, and it's written by the commander. Now, obviously, it's the same as if you have Patton telling his story, or any commander's going to tell it in a way that is flattering to themselves. Nevertheless, it's the best source we've got. At the very least, it's telling you what he thought people wanted to hear about a good commander, what the Romans would admire. So having done lots of academic work on the Roman army and then starting to write books for the more general audience, my early ones tended to be more military. They were conflict-related, Roman army-related. But I kept thinking I wanted to go back to Caesar, because whenever you write histories of a war, you have to start explaining what's the society, what's the political system. To the extent you can, what's the economy? That's often very hard to do in the ancient world. And people like Caesar, I'd written a chapter or two on him in books like In the Name of Rome that looked at other commanders. And doing that, I just thought, and I'd written a short book on the Civil War, I want to do Caesar completely. And then the best two biographies at the time were still both written by Germans, by Gelser, that was quite old, and Meyer, that was more recent, very much were political biographies. And that was generally the case of any academic work or academics writing for a wider audience. Because on the whole, especially then and to some extent even now, academics aren't really interested in warfare. They think wars and battles are simple. I don't really want to do that, because if I do that, declaring you're a military historian in those days, people tended to interpret that as some desire to invade Poland. It was essentially this thought that you thought war was great, that you had to study something, you had to actually approve of it, which is very odd, given that people can study things like slavery, and I don't think anyone is arguing, hey, that's a great idea, let's bring that back. So there was, at the moment I'm in the very early stages of preparing for a book on an overview of ancient warfare, and I'm going back to a lot of the study of prehistoric stuff, and there was this general trend in academia till the end of the 20th century to avoid warfare as much as possible, in history and particularly in archaeology, and talk about everything else. So I came to look at things, well, if you look at Caesar, can we actually write a biography of Caesar as if he was a modern statesman, general, politician, and ask all the questions, follow him through his life, what was his childhood like, how did he grow up, what happens at various stages, asking the questions even if there isn't enough evidence to give a good answer, which is often going to be the case. And then if you look at Caesar from the age of just over 40, 42 really, 41st, 42nd year, the rest of his life is dominated by warfare. He has been on campaign a few times before, but the last third of his life, he's on campaign every year, and he's fighting a lot of battles. He's basically moving around. And if you read most of the earlier biographies of Caesar, you didn't get that impression at all. He'd go off to Gaul, and then we'd really be talking about, well, what's happening back in Rome. I've tried with everything I've written about a person, it's the same with Alexander the Great, the studies of him tended to be dominated by ideas of either the good Alexander, who had this view of brotherhood of mankind, was going to bring all the cultures and races together under one rule in one golden age of peace, or the bloodthirsty savage who was just conquering everybody. They talked a lot about what sort of state he was going to create, all this sort of thing. When you actually look at his life, he has almost no time to do any of these things because he's nearly always traveling and fighting or recovering from wounds. And he's vast distances away from the center of the empire he's creating. So one of the reasons his empire doesn't last when he dies is that he hasn't spent time putting it together. And the same with Caesar. There's often a contrast between Caesar and Augustus in that Caesar's the man who gets stabbed to death at a meeting of the Roman Senate. Augustus is the man who lives to a ripe old age and dies peacefully. So therefore, the academic logic was, well, Caesar obviously gets things badly wrong and annoys people, whereas Augustus is the super tactful, far more adept politician who persuades people to accept him. And that's fine until you look at Caesar and say, well, actually, he's only in Rome for a few months in 46 and then late 45 and early 44 BC. So the idea that he's creating a regime, unlike Augustus, who is there on and off for decades and who's killed all the potential challengers, you're not comparing like with like. And you only realize that when you go back to really old-fashioned narrative history, which concentrates on what's happening in each year. Where is the person? What are they doing? And then tries to understand, again, a sense of the experience. If you are doing, or the fact that Caesar wrote all these letters to people, which sadly have not survived. Now, we know there was a whole collection of letters between Cicero and Caesar, still around in antiquity. We haven't got them. And you get, there's another letter. Cicero gets a letter from his brother when he's with Caesar's army in Britain in 54 BC. And this letter gets there in about a month to Rome. And the Romans only stay in Britain for a couple of months. So it shows you how the communication system is operating, even at this point. And the really annoying thing is that, of course, Quintus Cicero says, well, I'm in Britain with Caesar, or at least Cicero tells us he's had a letter from Quintus in Britain. But moving on from that, I'm going to talk about other things rather than this nice eyewitness account of a very dramatic event. So it's that sort of thing. And those letters remind you of how mundane a lot of everybody's life is, no matter how dramatic your story might seem from a distance. It's trying to put all that together. I wanted a modern biography of an ancient person as far as you could. And as I say, there are lots of bits where you've just got to admit we don't know. And you're guessing. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
You say that much. In a lot of times you'll say, did he do this for this motivation or that? Well, they're not incompatible. You know what I mean? You'll add little key details to say both can be true at the same time kind of stuff. And like, you can't know, right? We can't go back and know. But I love that style that you bring to the table.
Well, to me, it's honesty.
Oh, go ahead.
Right? It's honesty. If you sort of think as a historian, well, I'll fill in all the gaps as best I can and then I'll present that as fact. That's much easier to read. And some people get deeply frustrated when you say, well, look, we don't know. This is the evidence. That's my guess. Don't know. And sometimes, particularly if you're answering questions after a lecture, the response is clearly their belief that you personally don't know and that the knowledge must be out there. It's just you're not good enough at your job to find out. So people often assume we've got far more information than we have. But I like to think of it almost as sort of history with the scaffolding still up, in that you're trying to show how this is not written for academics. This is written for anyone interested enough to pick up the book. But how do we learn about the past? How do we try to understand it? How can we guess what really happened and then why and then understand it? So that's the aim always. But it does, some people find it frustrating because it does mean there's a lot of, well, in the end, we don't know.
Yes, sir. My second question is, Caesar is one of those figures where the myth and the man have become almost inseparable. How did you approach peeling back the layers of legend to find the historical person underneath, and where was that most difficult?
As always, it's in the earlier part of someone's life and then in their private life, because we just don't have the information. And with somebody like Caesar, most of the sources are written down after his death, after he's become dictator, after he's done all these things. Just the same as Augustus. People write about him and they look back and they start maybe maybe they think they remember something where somebody says, so you have these stories about Caesar when he's about 18. He is, for a while, the dictator Sulla, who's just seized Rome, massacred all his opponents, has had these things called a prescription list, where you basically post a list of names up in the forum, and anyone on that list loses all legal rights. Therefore, anybody can kill them. If you cut off their head, take it to the authorities, you get a share of their property. So there are heads nailed up on the speaker's platform in the middle of Rome. It is incredibly violent time. Caesar has been told by Sulla to divorce his wife because she happens to be the daughter of one of Sulla's opponents, now dead. And Caesar, this kid of 18, says no. And for a while is a hunted fugitive. And eventually Caesar's mother, who has cousins who have connections on the sort of Sullan side of things, basically persuades Sulla to let him go. And supposedly Sulla is supposed to say, you've got to watch this one, basically. There are many Mariuses in this Caesar. Marius was Sulla's original opponent, Caesar's uncle by marriage. Did he really say that at the time? This is still some 18-year-old kid. And sometimes, you do look at people and you think, oh, yeah, that one's going to go on and do well, or that one's going to be trouble. But on the other hand, it's a nice story when everybody knows what's happening later, that Caesar will go on to become dictator just as Sulla had done, will do so by winning a civil war, but won't prescribe people, won't massacre his enemies like Sulla, which is partly why enemies like Brutus and Cassius get to kill him. But you have these inventions, the same as, stories about the infant Augustus crawling along and getting up to a high place in the house and being discovered sort of staring out to watch the rising sun, and this sense of destiny. Again, maybe not. You come back to the speculation. What did this mean when you say, well, why did Caesar stand up to this dictator? Was it, simply stubbornness? He didn't want to be told what to do. Did he just love his wife? You have all the stories about Caesar's womanizing affairs with other people's wives. As far as I can see, they all come from later, after the wife he wouldn't divorce has died. So, but that doesn't mean he was entirely faithful before then. So hindsight is the big problem. And when you get to Caesar, and this follows him all the way through his life, because you have some people presenting him as this man who is constantly plotting revolution. He wants to rise to the top, wants to be dictator. I think that's hindsight. To me, if you look, you can actually look at most of his career, and it's very conventional until later on, in unconventional times. But then, of course, you get to the even greater problem in that when Caesar is murdered, a civil war develops within months between Caesar's former supporters and Caesar's assassins. The assassins are saying, well, we had to kill him because if we hadn't done that, he would have done A, B, and C, and wouldn't that have been terrible? Whereas the supporters are saying, well, look how terrible it was he was killed. If only he hadn't died, he would have done all these wonderful things. It's the sort of JFK situation. What would have happened? Would this have gone on to do greater things? Would there have been scandals? Would there have been problems? You can pitch it either way. And because it didn't happen, we don't know. But this tends to cloud all the sources for earlier on and just what's happening. So you just have to look at each thing. Obviously, the first thing is say, well, when is it written? And do we know by whom it's written, or what's the likely source? But if we have something that occurs in the biography written by, say, Suetonius or Plutarch, we have two biographies of Caesar, but they're both written in the early 2nd century AD, using sources we no longer have, but that's, a century and a half nearly after Caesar's died, in a very different world, a world that's ruled by emperors, and emperors that start with the line of Augustus that makes himself Caesar's adopted son, calls himself Caesar. So they know what's going to happen. And later you'll get historians like Dio writing in the 3rd century AD, when he's a Greek from Asia Minor, but he's a Roman senator as well. So he very much thinks in that imperial way. This is just, Caesar had to become dictator because that's the only way things work if you have one man in charge. Monarchy works, democracy doesn't, is his rather bland statement. So you've got to take that all into account, then look at the plausibility and simply rank them up against each other. If you've got something nearer to the time, maybe that's better, but sometimes that can be so obviously biased if it's delivered by someone hostile to Caesar. So really, you go through at each stage, and as I say, try and let people know what you're doing, and not say 100% this is certainly what happened, unless you've got, on those rare occasions, you've actually got an inscribed law or record of that can piece it down. The contemporary stuff is better in that Cicero is around, he knew Caesar. Caesar's own account is also good because although, yes, it's biased and obviously very flattering to himself, he couldn't distort the facts by too much, because people would know. And we know that his own officers, like Quintus Cicero, are writing back home from the campaigns in Gaul, and that some of them are connected to people who don't particularly like Caesar. So, and we can also see from Cicero those moments where there are rumors in Rome of what Caesar's doing or what's happened that prove to be completely false. So it reminds you of how much today, the story gets reported, it circulates very quickly, and then people actually realize the civil war that we associate with Caesar crossing the Rubicon, in a sense, began a week or two earlier when one of the consuls heard a rumor that Caesar had invaded Italy when he hadn't, and goes off and proclaims to Pompey and gives him a sword, defend the Republic. And then they find out that there isn't actually an invasion, so they sort of go quiet for a while. But that's, again, that sort of human detail always comes across as more likely. This element of confusion, mistakes, people jumping to the wrong conclusions, and also the human element, they sometimes get angry and they do stupid things because they don't particularly like someone or do. So it's a balancing act. You just try to be honest, and you try and your best guess with available evidence is what you come back to.
I'm going to go off script here for one of these questions because you brought up one detail that I really wanted to emphasize listening to your audiobook on Caesar. So make sure you go and get it on Audible, ladies and gentlemen. You mentioned Caesar's sex life, okay? And in different locations throughout this biography, from Caesar being kind of a, ladies' man, and not just any ladies' man. We're talking like his pals or even opponents within the Senate and high political figures. He's sleeping with their wives, according to these accounts. And you use the word cuck, like he's I guess that's how they would call it, like you're cucking the other people and their wives. And there's a sense in which you get the impression that he gets off on doing this to the other people's wives. Like there's a thrill on doing this to opponents' wives or even other people's wives. There's some type of thrill he's after. The other thing, if you don't mind commenting in this comment / addressing a point you bring up in the biography, is there was a rumor, and I don't know how true it is or what you really make of it at the end of the day, that Caesar's visiting practically what we would call ancient Phoenicia, this region of Tyre, if you will, where there's a king. If I'm not mistaken, this is the geographical
Nicomedes, Nicomedes, Bithynia, more that area, so a bit further
Bithynia.
North. Yeah.
Okay. And he is supposedly spending too much time in this area with the guy, and he's young. He's not somebody yet, but maybe he was like a lover or this man's kind of sex toy, if I could use the term. I mean, and then next thing you know, this haunts him the rest of his life, it seems, with rumors saying, hey, you were this guy's, sexting or something. What are your comments on this?
It's a sense this is a period where we get all this gossip. The story is he goes off to visit the court of King Nicomedes because he's asked to raise ships to support the Roman war effort that's going on in Asia. And he stays too long, and then sources, it's the same way you get these newspaper or TV stories now. Somebody who claims to be there is saying to somebody else that, well, I saw him at a party when he was, doing this, and he was being... the idea is, again, the Romans aren't too bothered from the aristocratic point of view if an adult man has an affair with a boy, as long as he does it discreetly. But it's not considered so honorable for the boy, particularly if the boy is a Roman aristocrat, because Roman aristocrats like to see themselves as superior even to the royal families of the rest of the world. Being a Roman meant something to anybody. Being a Roman aristocrat from a senatorial family and a patrician like Caesar meant that you were the master of the world, one of them, of this group. So the idea that this fella goes out and then is seduced by this sort of elderly, debauched Eastern king, it's great gossip, and it gets repeated again and again. It's one of those things. Early on, Caesar will make jokes about it. Later on, when he's actually dictator, he goes into the forum and takes a public oath that there's no truth in it, which of course just fuels the rumors all the more. It's the same as when a politician gets to denying something, people are starting to think, hello, what's going on? What have they really been up to? So you have to wonder, it's the only story about Caesar that implies a relationship with another male at all. That's the only one, which you get with other figures. You do get more of that. So that's unusual. It's certainly the only one that shows him, you weren't supposed to be the more passive partner. We won't go into too graphic a detail in this, but that was considered much less honorable, the sort of slang, the swear words and things about it. And it goes back, again, Greek ideas that there's, that the Romans have partly taken on, but they're not too sure about. It does seem to be, sorry.
No, please.
Well, it does seem to be later that, again, it's from about 70 BC onwards where it appears. But on the other hand, we don't know much about Caesar before 70 BC and the death of his first wife, when he is suddenly this man who is sleeping with most of the sort of young noble women of Rome. And, including the wife of Pompey, the wife of Crassus, the two really big men who become his allies. Caesar's married 3 times. He divorces one wife, Pompeia, because during this festival that was only celebrated by the women of Rome, the wife's lover has disguised himself as a woman, crept into the house, Caesar's house where it's being held because he's the high priest, and is discovered by a maid, runs away, this scandal, and then for political reasons, Caesar won't testify against the man, but he divorces his wife, and then you get the famous comment, well, why did you do that if you didn't think there's anything wrong with it? And he said, because Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. So he doesn't respond too well to the idea that his wife is sleeping around. And there may be other reasons, perhaps for whatever reason, this was not a very successful marriage, whether personally or even in the Roman sense for the aristocracy, it's very much what are the political connections I'm getting for this? Maybe it wasn't working. But nevertheless, but on the other hand, he is credited with sleeping with lots of them. Most famously, you have Servilia, who is the mother of Brutus, who is the half-sister. They share the same mother as Cato, who will become Caesar's bitterest opponent. And of course, Brutus, the man who's going to stab Caesar. So you have this long-term, and that affair seems to go on throughout their lives, even when Caesar is dictator, and they're both well into middle age. At that point, it's noted that he brings a pearl home from Britain to give to her because she was very fond of pearls, but also he sells her property that's been confiscated from his enemies at a knockdown price. The rumor then at the time, though, is also that he's sleeping with her daughter, Tertia, who is wife to Cassius. So the whole thing has this weird soap opera element about it. And we get this Cicero joke that, the price was so good because there was a third off the price. Because women couldn't vote, you only got one name as a girl and they numbered them to tell them apart. So all the sisters would be juniors. So, this is Brutus' half-sister, it's Cassius's wife, and Caesar is having an affair with. But apparently, this does not in any way break the relationship with Servilia, the mother. That's the weird thing. You get the impression with Caesar, and then, obviously, famously, Cleopatra is the well-known lover, but he later goes on to have an affair with the Queen of Mauritania a few months after he's left Cleopatra. There are stories that the people don't tend to be named in Gaul of various mistresses there. Even later on, under the emperors, we have this Gallic aristocrat who claims to be Caesar's illegitimate descendant. So he's basically claiming that, great-grandmother had this fling with Caesar when he passes through and considers this a point of pride. So it's very odd in that I think part of it is Caesar's desire. He'd prefer, like a lot of politicians, to be talked about, even if that's in terms of being notorious, rather than to be forgotten. He's got to make a name for himself, and he's very visible. He dresses differently. He acts differently. He's very active in the courts, which are held in public. All this scandal, all this gossip, some of it may be that he's trying to cover up the fact and say, no, I wasn't really seduced by this dirty old man, king from the East, that, I'm a real man's man. I only go for women. I only do this. Some of it's also, as you say, it's proving I'm better than you. And some of it, it's clearly not just about sex, because this is a slave-owning society, apart from all the professional courtesans and the other. If you just want to have sex with someone, when you own them, they're not legally allowed to resist. So it seems to be about seduction partly, perhaps proving he's better, but also I think this generation of aristocratic women are much better educated than they have been in the past, but their husbands are often away on imperial service. So I think there's an element, Servilia, the mother of Brutus, is clearly ferociously intelligent. and is a very keen political manipulator, because the way she marries her daughters off, the way she promotes her son's career, her brother's career, it's very, very skillful. She gets ties to nearly all the big families. Cleopatra clearly is phenomenally bright and very political. So Caesar does seem to be drawn to women that in a sense are rather like himself. They are a little bit, morally a little bit questionable, but they're very bright, they're very ambitious, they're very skillful. So you feel there's something about the affairs of it all as well. I mean, this you're getting into speculation here, obviously, but it is striking that these are the women he seems to have relationships with, and particularly the ones that last, like Cleopatra and like Servilia, are with very bright, very ambitious, very politically minded women.
As a historian in the ancient Roman world, I think it's worth asking a question about ethics here, or how sex is viewed on a moral grounds, especially with what my forte has been, biblical material. We're talking about Christianity, which has risen at a time in which the Roman Empire is obviously very much the heart of the world in which it's birthed. And I've heard a lot of people, I think they're mistaken, and I've seen ancient sources myself, but I want to get it from an expert, who imply that the Romans were a bunch of heathens, the pagans were a bunch of just heathens, and they were into sexual deviancy, like they were fond of it. Like it was just normal, it was in the open, it was okay, it was expected, or normalized, so to speak. And as we just described Caesar in these terms of doing these kinds of things, how would you address this issue of sexual morality and how that worked out in the ancient Roman world?
First thing to say, obviously, the Roman world covers a lot of ground, both in time and in distance. There's a lot of people out there. We get sources for some of them. Things do change. There's the impression of decadence under emperors like Caligula and Nero, let alone Elagabalus in the 3rd century, who's supposed to have awarded provincial commands to the man with the biggest penis of the selected candidates, this sort of thing. So you get these stories. So you get a lot of gossip, you get a lot of salacious stuff. And clearly there are these people who are doing these crazy, wild things as there are elsewhere. The late Republic is a little bit different, and this is still, in some ways, it's almost like Victorian England. It presents this public facade of respectability, proper behavior, the sense that, the elder Cato, who's 2nd century BC, he tells a story that, say, a good Roman should only embrace his wife when she's frightened by a thunderstorm. So he says, that's why I pray for storms, basically. It's this. But on the other hand, he's weirdly prudish in that respect. But he also, one of his other sayings was that he always made time and would stop public business and come back so that he could help his wife babe their infant. It's a very sort of modern, hands-on involvement of a parent. So, and the Greeks look at the Romans, and the Greeks think the Romans are a bit weird. So they have the story that the Romans would only have sex with their wife in the dark because otherwise she might think she was being treated like a prostitute. You have, on the one hand, at certain levels, very obvious, and you go and see the brothels and things like that in Pompeii, elsewhere, the graffiti, some of it's obscene. Some of it seems obscene to us, but it probably wouldn't. So a lot of the drawings of phalluses and things like that are quite common. Again, in this polytheistic system, you could think of within Hinduism and things, it's not meant as rude in quite the same way that we would have it with the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Wow.
But you have public, our word fornicate comes from fornix, which is an arch, because that's where a lot of prostitutes, the cheaper ones, would ply their trade under an arch. But if you went back to any big city a few centuries ago, you would find off the main streets into the sort of the less salubrious areas, brothels, prostitutes, this sort of thing would be there. So sometimes societies present this view of themselves as very respectable. And it's, again, come back to the point, it's a slave-owning society. Human beings can be property, and they lose all rights to do that. On the other hand, you will commonly find often on tombstones and other records, somebody who will be a libertaric conjuge, freed woman and wife, someone where you've owned this woman as a slave, freed her and married her. Now, of course, all you see is the official version, and that implies some sort of affection. But on the other hand, she's a slave at first. Did she have any choice? So you get these relationships that the best way of looking at it is probably as somebody else once said, people are probably doing all the things they're doing now. They just call it something different. And that human nature and human desires haven't really changed that much. What's considered respectable? You were supposed to present this public appearance of respectability. On the other hand, if you look at Cicero's speeches and other hints of political invective at trials, the abuse you will hurl at someone often very quickly goes into the obscene, because the whole point is, if you're arguing against somebody's point of view, you want to dismiss them as a personality, as a character, and just say they're awful, therefore why should anyone listen to this? So a surprising number of accusations of incest that are thrown around, partly because your sister is likely to be the only unmarried woman around in your house. But they throw this at each other. I don't think anyone's taking it too seriously. There are clearly some people who don't read the poems of Catullus and his long-term affair. Well, he basically falls for this woman he dubs Lesbia, who is probably the sister of a chap called Clodius, who's leading patrician, a sometime ally, sometimes enemy of Caesar, a politician in his own right. And Catullus is in love with her for a couple of poems, saying how wonderful she is and how happy they're going to be. She then dumps him, and he spends most of the rest of the book, every few poems, he just moans about her and complains about her, and claims she's sort of killing so many lovers per night by her sort of sheer vigor and all this sort of stuff. Rupturing their intestines is the literal Latin. It's the discarded sort of teenager just feeling bitter about this, but put into very elegant, sophisticated Latin if you don't mind it dirty. So you have that going on, and he will write some stuff that's crude about Caesar, but Caesar doesn't take it personally. You will move on later to the world of Ovid. You could read his Ars Armatoria, his Art of Love, where he claims it's like a manual to, instead of teaching a general how to conduct a war, this is how a lover should conduct his love affairs. It's not so much about sex, it's more about seduction, picking somebody up and then dumping them when you've got bored and moving on to the next one. But it's a bit like some of those sort of weird swinging bachelor films of the 60s. That's slightly odd. But he gets exiled ostensibly for this, though he was also involved in a scandal with Augustus's granddaughter. So there are a range of opinions, as there are about so many things in the Roman world, whether it's this, how you should behave privately, whether it's about how our empire should work, what we should do, should we conquer, should we not. There's a whole range of opinions, in the same way that you can clearly see somebody like Caesar. Suetonius says he's never held back from doing anything by any religious scruple. He is Pontifex Maximus, the same title that ultimately will get passed on to the Pope. Mm-hmm. He doesn't come across as a very religious man in any way whatsoever. Though he does have this strong sense in his own destiny. He talks about being descended from the goddess Venus, but that's more of a sort of showing off thing. But you will get other people like Varro, who writes at the time, who clearly take a lot of these old traditions very seriously indeed. So again, they're people. They've got a whole range of different ways of looking at this, but don't think of the Romans as all orgies, all sort of sex out in the open, and just whenever you feel like it. There are rules. Where you are supposed to do things in a dignified way and privately and behind the scenes as much as possible. If you're an aristocrat, it's like there's a nice line from Cicero that no good man ever dances while sober. They have these sort of odd sayings that come out, but it's a range of opinions. It's very much a range, and they're people. They're like us.
Yeah, I just think that's important to address, because a lot of us come out of a very specific world where we view things black and white and not realize actually it's not that way. So thank you for taking the time to take us down into the debauchery of the ancient world for a moment. And of course, showing that, no, a lot of this, you could see even the fact that they're throwing dirty words at people is a sign that this is not good, right? So it's like, hey, you wouldn't use those words if society, or at least the people around you, didn't also view ethically, like, hey, yeah, that's at least publicly. We can't read their minds,
Exactly. There's got to be enough in common that when a new idea like Christianity comes along, somebody says, oh, I like that, or that makes sense. There's got to be common ground. This idea, sometimes even scholars will sort of deny any morality in the Greco-Roman past. And it's, it's clearly nonsense. They have clear concepts of good and evil. They might not be the same for every person, even within the same society, but people have these rules, and there is this sense, and there are certain things that are taboo, and that when you get rumors, you'll get with Nero to some extent, and again, Elagabalus is a big Caracalla, and other accusations that emperors having affairs with their mothers, this sort of thing. People clearly react that this is wrong. This is not what you should be doing. So again, the abuse of, yes, Clodius is having an affair with his sister. You throw that at them because the audience is going to say, well, he shouldn't be doing that. Then should he? It's not, even if they consider it a possibility that maybe he has or not, or just take it as abuse. It's within that range of, there's probably a lot more common within broader a range of societies where people actually think some things are, yeah, that's good, that's bad. Doesn't have to be so specific, but it's just the way societies have developed.
Thank you. Third question I have is, one thing that strikes readers of your book is how deeply Roman politics functioned on personal relationships, patronage, and debt. Can you walk us through how the system actually worked and how Caesar exploited it better than anyone?
It's quite a small world. Rome is still, although it has a population, there are, certainly by the end of the first century BC, there are probably 1 million people living in Rome. It is a huge city. It is far bigger than any other city in the Greco-Roman world. Alexandria might have 300,000, something like that, and most are much, much smaller. But at the top, there are 600 senators, and they know each other. And particularly the ones that matter know each other. And you have this great sense of family tradition. How important you were was reflected by where you lived. If you could afford a house on the edge of the Forum, slopes of the Palatine, some of these houses, or at least the sites, have been occupied for centuries, almost since Rome began. It means you've made it. If you can get to live there, where you can walk very easily to all the important things going on in the city, in the porch of that house, you will have all the symbols of office, of successes, of magistracies that people have held, of all your ancestors. When somebody dies in your family, you have a public funeral that begins in the Forum, even though the cremation will occur outside the boundary of the city because that's considered proper. You get actors to wear the funeral masks and the regalia of all your ancestors. So every time somebody dies, the family takes the opportunity to advertise, this is the brand of the Caecili Metelli or the Scipiones or something like this. Remember, generation after generation, for centuries, we've done all these great things for the Republic. We have shared in, we've done this. And then you get one of the younger members of the family to deliver an oration in praise of whoever's just died, which sort of introduces them to the political sphere, to the public. Because in the end, you don't succeed to any of this office automatically. You have to be elected. And the system has these increasingly senior posts from the age of 30 when you're a quaestor up to the consulship you can have when you're 42. There are 8 quaestors. There are 2 consuls. By after Sulla, there's even more quaestors than, eventually get up to 20 and 25. There are only ever 2 consuls. So you can see it's like a funnel that fewer and fewer people can get to the very top. So you have to keep telling the voters where you don't tend to have elections on particular campaigns and promises and policies. It isn't like that. There are no parties. There isn't any sense. There are styles of politics where you take up particular causes or act in a certain way, but there are family connections. But because even the family can't share the consulship, in the end, everyone's an individual. And everyone has to convince enough Roman voters. They call where we get our republic from, res publica, the public raises thing, commonwealth. It's that sense of we're all part of this shared state. And any citizen, any male citizen who's there physically present in Rome can vote for you. So when you're seeking election, you become a candidatus, a candidate. You wear this, candida means white, particularly powerfully bleached toga. So it's gleaming white. So you stand out in the crowd and then you walk up and down talking to people and hoping that people will join you and walk up and down with you to show that you're important, to show that they favor you and that therefore friends of theirs. But, and people who owe them money or owe them debts or have had past favors from them will also think, I'll vote for you. So it's this combination of the established families are advertising themselves all the time. If you're someone like Caesar, who comes from an ancient family, but one that hasn't been important politically for centuries, you've got a problem because you won't automatically be voted for. So you've got to make your own name, which is in part wear long sleeves instead of short sleeves, wear your hair a bit looser, your belt looser so your tunic hangs down, look different. Be very active in the courts, give lots of speeches, support popular causes, get talked about even if it's gossip, get noticed, and then spend whenever you get to an election to give people gifts, promise people everything. That Cicero writes this election manual for his brother where he says it's distressingly modern in many respects. He says, if anybody comes and asks you to do something when you're elected, say yes, because if you don't, they won't vote for you. And once they voted for you and you've won, they'll understand if you don't have time to fulfill all the promises that you made in the campaign. So it's sort of, oh, well, fair enough. People, oh, well, it's politics. But you promise people things. You also advertise yourself. So you get opportunities. When you're in these posts, you don't tend to get much in the way of public funds. So as Aedile, for instance, Caesar is responsible for staging games, which were traditionally beast fights, where wild animals are brought into the temporary arena and killed for the bloodthirsty amusement of the Roman public. He also decides at the same time that even though his father died ages ago, that he's going to celebrate gladiatorial games, which at this point are only for funeral commemorations. So he stages those, and he stages those in the lavish way where the gladiators have silver decoration on their armor to look more spectacular. And he's been buying up, he'll keep on doing this. He'll buy up gladiators who lose to get them healed, train them, and then train them up until they're better, until he's got a whole corps. He owns thousands of gladiators by the time of the Civil War as an investment. But the thing is, Caesar doesn't have a lot of money, and he spends as if he's got 10 times as much, so that he has to borrow money. And essentially, he goes to other aristocrats and tells them, invest in my career. It's like buying shares almost in Caesar, because you're gambling on the fact that he will keep on winning election, and therefore he will have more and more opportunity to do you favors, do things that you will need, be a useful connection. So at one point, when he's about to go off to govern Spain, most of his creditors call in his debts because they've decided, yeah, it's not worth the risk. I don't think this guy really is going to get to the top, and I want my money. And in fact, the big financier Crassus, with whose wife, his wife is one of the ones Caesar's supposed to have seduced, but nevertheless sees Caesar as a good political investment. He covers all the debts. It ties Caesar to Crassus, along with the alliance with Pompey. It'll be the big feature of the latter part of Caesar's life. But again, he's gambling on the fact that Caesar will keep winning. And Caesar will do the same. So Sallust, who's one of Caesar's senators, says that Caesar needed this. He needed a war. He needed victory. He needed profit. And he's looking for this. He gets it in Gaul, makes himself fabulously wealthy through the campaigns there, where there's talk of the enslavement of 1 million people. And he's very generous he shares the spoils out with anyone, but nevertheless, he's making a lot. So if you go to Rome today, can't see too much, but behind the Senate house that Caesar planned but didn't finish, you've got Caesar's Forum. He bought up land right in the heart of Rome. So this is incredibly expensive real estate to build a forum which would be used entirely for public business and commercial opportunities, for which he will make no profit, but is a gift to the Roman people. But he buys that with money from the spoils of this campaign. It's a sense of giving it back, but advertising himself. He gives huge loans and gifts to other politicians, sometimes, and says, we'll hire you to do this, but also he's investing in them just as people have invested in him. So it's this ongoing thing, because in the end, the election cycle is every year. You can only be consul for a year, then you might go off to a province. You can't be consul again for 10 years. So nobody is holding on to power for a long time. So it's back and forth all the time, but you've got this opportunity, and there are far more people out there who are ambitious and want the job than can actually hold it. So all that's going on. It all requires money. And the thing is, the more one candidate spends, then the more everybody else involved has to spend to keep up with them, or even better, spend more. So you have cases where it wasn't just money. Pompey the Great is wealthier than Caesar to start off with. He celebrates games in Rome that are supposed to make him really popular, and he brings elephants into the arena. And the crowd feels sympathy with the elephants. They think when they're trumpeting, they sound a bit like people, that they're showing human emotions. So it doesn't work. Unlike Caesar's gladiators with their silver armor, you've got to be, as well as a politician, you've almost got to be a sort of well, like an old, Busby Berkeley, Hollywood showman, this sort of thing. There's an element of you've got to be able to stage these spectacles with style. Because again, it's like the latest blockbuster movie. You can spend vast amounts on it, but people won't necessarily watch it if it's no good, if it doesn't strike that chord with them. So you've got to be a showman, the sort of Barnum and Bailey, as well as a politician. Some people don't have that skill. So it isn't just about money, but there's an interesting case where Cato, we've mentioned before, there's one election where the bribery is so blatant and staggering that he declares that whoever wins, he is going to prosecute because they could only have won in this year if they were corrupt. Then he makes the exception that, well, if my son-in-law wins, then that's all right. We won't brother-in-law. Sorry, brother-in-law. It's Servilia's husband. It's not his son-in-law that time. And he doesn't, and that's sort of considered to be okay. That's moral as far as the Romans are concerned. But it's what we would consider to be blatant, staggering corruption, but it is actually the system. And a lot of times it works well for the Republic. They produce a lot of talented people. So, who knows? It's not our way, but it worked for them.
Wow. You mentioned the Gallic Wars. So Caesar wrote his own account, of course, of the Gallic Wars and Civil War. But I really want to talk about the relationship of Caesar and Pompey as well. So there's a couple interesting things. Maybe we do the Caesar and Pompey thing, and then we can talk about this idea that no, let's do the goal. Let's do the goal okay. Here because it resulted in what some modern scholars have called a genocide. Potentially over 1 million killed, as you said, and over and another million enslaved. How should we weigh his military genius against that level of destruction? And how did Romans themselves view it, which clearly would probably reflect a difference on how we view things versus what they view things. But yeah.
Caesar wrote for the audience of contemporary Romans, and I favor the interpretation that he probably wrote the books year by year. He waited till winter when the campaign was over, wrote them, they were sent back to Rome, and they were read out. The idea was, because again, copying a manuscript by hand, time-consuming, expensive, not many people can afford get all the new books, but you can have a group, a dinner party, and somebody can read it out. And they read very well. We see this as appalling imperialism, colonialism, all this sort of thing. And obviously from the perspective of many of the people living in Gaul, they're certainly going to think that way. Except that it isn't ever simple, as it wasn't with more recent empires, in that quite a lot of leaders and tribes and groups within Gaul welcome Caesar and see the Romans as a useful ally against the other tribe that lives across the river that they've lived alongside for generations and they really, really hate, but who have had the cheek to be better at fighting than they are more recently. So there are quite a few tribes that never fight the Romans at all and join them, see them as a big friend. There are others that join them and then think after a few years, well, this has been quite good, but actually now I'd prefer they went away because I prefer to be important here. So we get these rebellions. So it isn't simple. Caesar presents it, though, for his audience of contemporaries as everything he does as being within the interest of the Roman Republic. So he responds to an appeal for help from an allied tribe that's being raided by another tribe and therefore goes and beats up that tribe. After that victory, another tribe comes and says, well, we've got problems with this Germanic warlord that's coming to us. Can you help us about this? And despite the fact that Caesar has arranged during his own consulship just before to have this chap named as king and friend of the Roman people, formal sort of acknowledgement, not quite of alliance, but nevertheless of friendship, Caesar still goes and fights him. He goes to Britain. Now, bear in mind, he's been given a province that's most northerly part. It's Provence in France today. It's southern France. And yet he ends up bridging the Rhine twice and crossing there. He comes twice to Britain. But he presents it as step by step. You've got to read it with a favorable point of view to Caesar. But from a Roman perspective, he's actually saying, well, what I'm doing is what a good Roman governor should do. If I didn't protect our allies, we won't have allies anymore. Why should anybody be our friends if we're not worth it? If I didn't deal with these threats to our allies, then again, so Roman power has expanded because of this. Yes, I've personally made a lot of money, but so have an awful lot of Romans and our imperium. Cicero talks about the Gauls, that they have this memory of back in the 4th century BC, the Gauls sacking Rome. Well, finally, we've defeated the Gauls, after all these centuries, and Caesar's doing this. Very few people. Cato criticizes Caesar for breaking a truce and attacking a Germanic tribe, or several Germanic tribes at that time, and that's a breach of faith, and it's presented as a war crime. But it isn't the killing, it's when you did it that he's considered as the sort of the bad thing. But again, if you go back to the Latin of the commentaries, Caesar talks about himself in the third person, famously. So it's Caesar did this sort of thing. And he's quite, although he's at the center of everything, he doesn't provide many details of what he's doing during a battle, what's happening to him. Sometimes you're left to imagine these heroic things, but he plays it very coolly. But what he does celebrate is nostri. That means our men, our lads, our boys. It's reporting very much on Romans going out and doing incredible things. And the heroes of the commentaries, yes, Caesar is there leading them and directing, but the real heroes are the soldiers, and particularly the centurions. That's the officer grade, that are probably reflective of the minor country gentry, the sort of middling classes, for want of a better term, back in Rome, back in Italy. And quite a lot of these people get named. Even when they don't get named, they're held up as the heroic. Even if they get things wrong, they're doing it because they're so brave and so inspired that sometimes they get out of hand and they get killed. But it's this emphasis on great courage, and it's our lads, our boys. And he goes into great detail about just how he built a bridge across the Rhine. It's not just that you fight these great hordes of enemies, but he doesn't go into all the classical descriptions you get in so many sources of barbarians painted with tattoos, with these grotesque weapons and their shouts and the noise. You don't get the barbarian stereotype much in Caesar. It's all quite plain. But what you do get is, doesn't matter how many of them there are, it doesn't matter how desperate the situation is, we find a way and we win. It doesn't matter what nature throws at us. Caesar comes twice to Britain, draws his ships up onto the beach on what's now southern England, and both times a storm blows up and wrecks half the fleet. You'd feel the second time round, you might have learned by this time, but because you've got tides that you have in the English Channel that you simply don't get in the Mediterranean. This is his knowledge of ships just doesn't apply on the sea. But he goes to the legions and finds out all the carpenters and craftsmen, and they just repair them or build new ones and get home. Anything that happens, we can do better. So you're not just winning against enemies, you're winning against nature itself. And that, for a Roman, to read this as a Roman, it must have been hard not to get really excited by this, because again, the Romans, they consider an increase of Roman power to be a good thing. Peace is something that comes after the subjugation of enemies or their submission. It isn't something that just happens naturally between two nations. Everybody out there's an enemy, really, until you've shown them that, they need to be frightened of you. So Caesar has more days of public thanksgiving voted to him than anybody in Roman history up to that point. And it's staggering. The things they're doing for the British expedition doesn't really achieve very much, but it's incredibly exciting, even to people who didn't particularly like Caesar. And, Cicero has very ambiguous feelings towards Caesar throughout most of this period, yet he's still excited, even though he says, oh, well, I don't think there's going to be much profit from it. I can't see the slaves being particularly well educated from this island in the middle of nowhere. But it's spectacular. It's exciting. So for a Roman, you have to think of it in that way. This is something, and if you just read Caesar and assumed he was telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, he presents it as, well, I had to do this. This was the only reasonable response I could do. Now, clearly, that's what he thinks, but also what he wants us to think. But it tells us a lot about how the Romans reconciled themselves to the idea of this expansion, this conquest. Again, you get an emphasis in Caesar. There are a few executions of Gauls, and at one point he executes nearly all the high council of one tribe, which must be an incredibly traumatic thing for a society. But when you get to the Civil War, that he also writes about in the same style, the great emphasis is on, well, when it comes to other Romans, I'm merciful on every occasion. And even in Gaul, I try to be. So it's an odd mixture, but you've got to think of this, you've got to try and approach it as a Roman would, and then use it as a historical source. But obviously, yes, this is not to be recommended. I didn't write the biography of Caesar and want to encourage people to go off and conquer things or start civil wars. This is not good behavior.
It's fascinating hearing you describe the details of these adventures. I mean, even I struggle when I read Alexander the Great. I go, I'm in awe of the conquest, right, that he accomplishes. But there's like two sides of me where there's like, okay, what about the poor tribes that they have, the poor villages that they end up, the people who die, right? So life sucks, and it's a pretty rough thing. But I would say something that I want to highlight before we move to Pompey and Caesar is this notion you said that he's a conquering nature. I don't know, and I kind of want to ask you, do you think there's some continuity to the Priam inscription that we found in 9 BCE with the Evangelion? I know I keep giving hints at gospel. I can't help it. It's what I know so much. But in those, even Philo of Alexandria, he's talking about Caesar Augustus, right? There's this idea that they conquer nature, they conquer sea, they can control weather, they have a capability of stopping famines and diseases, and they're demigods. I mean, they have like this ability that goes beyond them. And is there hints of that in what you're describing by what Caesar's doing, where it's like kind of legendizing things, even in his own writing, you think?
Not in the same way that you have Alexander, for instance, consciously having stories written about him. And you have the story of Augustus later on. He felt Alexander allowed the historians he took on campaign with him to exaggerate. So you have the stuff about the sea bowing down to him and all this sort of thing. And Augustus saying, stick to the truth. If you're Alexander, you don't need to exaggerate. Caesar's writings come, and his behavior comes very much within a tradition. He isn't the first Roman proconsul to go out and fight wars. And the Romans celebrate getting to places that no one's ever been to before and meeting peoples and forcing them to submit that no one's ever done before, and then quantifying things. So in the triumphal inscriptions, people will list the number of towns they stormed, the number of cities, the number of ships they captured, the number of enemies they defeated. There's one poor bloke who didn't get to do anything very dramatic, but he actually enumerates in very great detail the miles of road that he built and the bridges over them and all this. They like quantity, but they did like that sense of there's a sort of two sides to this. On the one hand, it is the sense we can go out and we will succeed anywhere. And it's a Roman thing that, the Rome is becoming better, Rome is becoming stronger. Remember, imperium, it means power. It's not literally physical empire. It's the sense Rome is becoming greater. But at the same time, you've got a very interesting thread of criticism in this generation of Romans of those who've become so wealthy but have stepped away from politics and use that ability to change nature to demolish hills so they can build their villa and get a better view, to create artificial lakes, to cultivate all these fish ponds, all this sort of thing, and the sense of excessive luxury that is also destroying nature. So you've got that going on at the same time, but this is seen as a positive thing. I think the tradition, it's a very Roman one. It's partly because the Romans, they're great surveyors. They have this sense of the world as something you can cut up into squares and divide up and mark out as we own this. And it probably comes in as well to deeper both Roman and Greek ideas of civilization and this sense that the wilder things are naturally. It's Caesar makes this great contrast all the way through that is clearly not true archaeologically, that the Gauls who live to the west of the Rhine are farmers, and the Germans, particularly the Suebi, who live to the east, are pastoralists. They don't settle down. They don't have fixed places. Now, again, we can tell this is not the case, but they are more dangerous because of that, because they're less civilized, because they need to be controlled. So there's an element of controlling nature gives you it. Caesar is clearly not pushing in any sense at this stage to sort of, I am greater than human. What he's trying to be is something that the Romans would consider to be even more important, that of all the servants of the state, of all the proconsuls who do these good things for the Republic, I'm doing it best. And I'm doing it better than anyone ever has in the past and any of you can do. And therefore, I deserve this respect. And the whole 25 days of public Thanksgiving, where the whole state is supposed to stop business and just say, wow, isn't it great, and offer sacrifices and prayers for the good of the Republic and what Caesar's done for us. It's within a very Roman context of this aristocracy that considers themselves really special anyway. The idea we are better than kings. Rome is the best state in the world. We are the leaders of Rome. Therefore, we are the pick of humanity, in a sense.
You could easily see legend building from that, of course.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So the relationship between Caesar and Pompey is one of the great political dramas of the ancient world. Was there a point where civil war became truly inevitable, or were there missed off-ramps that could have changed everything?
I remember writing this book, and when you come back to the period, you always feel you just want to grab them by the collar and shake them and say, look, you don't need to do this, because any possible outcome of what you're doing is going to be worse than not doing it. But it's an interesting thing. You have the alliance, first of all, when you've got Crassus alive, then an alliance of three with Caesar sort of catching up with the other two that are more established men, already wealthy. It keeps in balance because no one wants to be picked on by the other two. So they're all suspicious. And Crassus and Pompey just don't really like each other deep down. So they're never going to be too close an ally without Caesar there. You also have, it's this remarkable thing. Caesar's only legitimate child, the only definite child that we know of, Caesarion, is probably Caesar's child, but that's it otherwise. There may be others elsewhere, like the ancestor of the Gaul we talked about earlier, but they're not recorded in anything we can rely upon. Julia is married to Pompey, who is older than Caesar, so is older than her own father. And the marriage appears to be a really happy one. It does seem to cement things, and it's you wonder if Julia has that Caesar charm. And Pompey was one of these people who had been the young dashing hero of the Republic, the Roman Alexander, not least, he's called Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great. The Romans have started calling Alexander the Great by this time, and Pompey is consciously identifying himself with Alexander, wears one of Alexander's cloaks, so he claims in a triumph, this sort of thing. I think Pompey loved adoration. So if you've got somebody who's young and charming and is devoted to you, it responds. It works. What was clearly a political marriage seems to function until she dies in childbirth and the child dies. Pompey then does what is natural for a Roman politician, thinks, well, I can make another political alliance through a new marriage. Caesar is supposed to have sort of combed through the family to find if we got any marriageable female we can rip it. There isn't. Pompey goes elsewhere. He marries the daughter of an aristocrat of aristocrats, who's sort of combined through adoption several major family lines in one, which is a great political alliance for him. So there's clearly tension. The civil war is possible because people who hate Caesar in the Senate, like Cato, like some of the others, like Bibulus, Caesar's former colleague as consul, think that Pompey is no longer Caesar's ally. And there's this whole build-up over the course of 18 months or so to the Civil War, where there's been chaos in Rome. There have been years where they couldn't hold elections because of political rioting. The Senate House has been burned down to cremate Clodius, the fellow I mentioned before, the charismatic, radical, demagogic politician who's murdered in fighting, and then his supporters carry him into the heart of Rome, the Senate House, and they cremate him there. So all of this is going on. You've got disturbed elections for a while. Pompey is sole consul. He brings organized bodies of troops into Rome itself to take charge, which is not what you're supposed to do at all. The Republic should be free of this. The army forms up outside the boundary of the city. So
he's already breaking that rule, though. So it's not like Julius Caesar's the first guy to do some of these no-nos.
Oh, no. Pompey's career in general has broken nearly all the rules. This is a man who, when he's about 19, 20, raises a private army, early 20s, during the civil war involving Sulla. He raises 3 legions out of his own pocket from his own estates, and then basically can't be ignored. And then Sulla accepts him, gives him commands, because better having the 3 legions on your side than somebody else's. He breaks all the rules. He's then given provincial command. Afterwards, he's sent to fight a civil war in Spain, in Africa. He doesn't enter the Senate until he actually becomes consul, and he does that when he's too young for the post. So he's broken every single rule there is about how the political career should work. And later on, yes, he does. Again, it's this idea this is a crisis. So the argument Caesar will have all the way through in the build-up to the Civil War is, what I've done for the good of Rome. And not only that, I've done it with powers that you, the Roman people, voted to me, all in a legal way. It's all done properly. You've then voted me more days of Thanksgiving for my successes than any commander has ever had in the past. All I want is to come back and stand for the consulship again without having to lay down my command. So I'll become consul again, which will give me another 12 months of office, at which point another provincial command. While you're consul or proconsul, you cannot be taken to court. You can't be put on trial. Once you're a private citizen, you can be. And for somebody like Caesar, even being charged is an insult, is a humiliation. It dents your auctoritas, your reputation. Cato and others have been proclaiming that they're going to do what had happened in Pompey's sole consulship, where a fellow called Milo, the one who's led the band that has killed Clodius, is put on trial with armed soldiers all around the court to make sure that Cicero, who's supposed to be defending him, is actually too nervous. He won't deliver the speech he's prepared. So Milo rushes off, knows he's going to be found guilty, goes off into exile. Cicero then rather tactlessly publishes the speech he would have given and sends a copy to Milo, who sort of rather tartly says, well, it's pretty good if only you'd actually said it at the time, this man. So this is a sense of, this is how chaotic Rome has got. Wow. Roman politics has been violent for a long time. Clodius and Milo's gangs have been disrupting elections, murdering each other, all that going on in the city. Pompey's come in with troops to restore order. So things aren't working long before Caesar crosses the Rubicon. And the argument basically comes around this, whether Caesar will be allowed to come back and go straight into another post, to which he'll have to be elected, but he's very confident that if the people get a chance, they will vote for him. Or does he lay down his powers, therefore he'll be taken to trial and charged, and even if he wants to stand for election, we might delay it for a year, and this will discredit him, or he can't be certain of a fair trial. There aren't many fair trials in general in Rome, but things were particularly bad. Pompey seems to want Caesar to accept that Pompey will protect him as his friend. So trust me, lay down your command, lay down your army, come back, you'll be all right, I'll look after you. And Caesar's thinking, well, can I actually trust him? Because other people have been friends of Pompey, and this hasn't always gone well in the crisis. Later on, this is writing under Nero, the poet Lucan sums it up as saying that the basic problem is that Caesar won't accept a superior in Pompey, and Pompey won't accept an equal. And Pompey, although he's only 5-6 years older than Caesar, his career's much older. He's been the great poster boy hero of the Roman Republic for generations before Caesar comes along. He doesn't really want to share the limelight, but also to admit that he has an equal, whereas Caesar just wants to be accepted. So the problem is that they can't meet in person because Caesar can't leave his province, which is in northern Italy, and they're not traveling up to get to him. Pompey's also got a province he can't go. He's in Spain, though he hasn't gone there, but he's got to stay outside Rome. So when the civil war begins, as I mentioned earlier, there's this false rumor in December 50 BC that Caesar has invaded Italy, and one of the consuls of the year goes to Pompey, hands him a sword and says, defend the Republic. And then a few days later report, actually, that's not true, nothing's happened. So they sort of shuffle on, the next year starts, new consuls take up office, and then it's in January 49, Caesar does cross the Rubicon.
That's actually my next question I was going to ask. But this is relevant. I'm glad you're smoothing into this because, what's going through Caesar's mind? Does he know that they're making false allegations that he crossed the Rubicon? So now we might as well. How you talked about the traveling of notes, throughout time. Maybe he gets notified. They're already accusing him. Well, damn it, I'm going. I don't know. What do you think happened? But anyway, the Rubicon is a big thing people like to ask. Did he cross it? Did he not? Please continue your train of thought, though.
It's essentially, they are communicating with each other all the time. They are writing letters. There are rumors. Cicero, who's been off governing Cilicia in southern Turkey, well, plus this is going on, we get wonderful reports about what's happening because he's asked this politician back in Rome to keep me up to date. What's happening? What are the rumors? What are the gossip? But you can't. It's a little bit like receiving a text or a short message from someone. It's a lot blunter than seeing them in person. If they've suddenly said, "Oh, I'm not coming to the dinner we organised tonight," you're more likely to get annoyed than if you actually speak and say, "Oh, sorry, something's come up," or I've family's sick or something like this. Everything, and the other thing is, of course, Caesar's charm can't work in the same way through letters as if he's in person. So it builds up to the point where clearly, but Caesar you have Mark Antony has been elected tribune, so he goes down there, who's probably not not the most tactful man around, but he is an aristocrat, and he's on Caesar's side. Caesar's been funding his career. So he's seen as provocative, but there is clearly a sense, ultimately, I mean, it's interesting that the Cicero's correspondence says that it's just hard to know what Pompey's thinking. And Pompey had this sort of very bland face. You just didn't know. And in the end, enough people think, or Caesar becomes convinced that Pompey isn't really going to back me. But Caesar crosses the Rubicon. Now, this, we can't find it now, but this marked the legal boundary between Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, but his province, and Italy proper, where he's not legally allowed to command an army unless he's just bringing back a detachment to celebrate a triumph, which he's not doing at this point. Because he does it in January, this is not the campaigning season. This is not when war should happen. So Pompey thinks that he's got months. There's going to be more negotiation. There's this unfortunate way people tend to think, and they talk about Caesar fighting the Senate and the Senate fighting Caesar. We know from the record of the debates that's come through beforehand that when there is actually one proposal is made to the Senate that both Pompey and Caesar should give up their commands and their armies, and at the same time, that is overwhelmingly supported by a majority of senators. 320 odd vote for it, 22 vote against it. It's those sorts of scale numbers. So the majority don't hate Caesar. They really just want peace. They don't want this to happen. But there is a very determined minority that wants to end Caesar's career. Caesar obviously gets to the point where he thinks, well, I've got to show them I'm serious. It's a little bit like gamblers raising the stakes. I think each side thinks the other one will back down. Because in the end, why fight a civil war over this? There are no political issues involved in this struggle. It is purely about, should Julius Caesar's career continue or should he be politically destroyed? That's it. And you think this ends up plunging the entire Mediterranean world into chaos and war for that. And when Caesar is supposed to looked at the dead Pompeians after the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 and said they wanted this, but for my army, they would have passed judgment on me. What is quite interesting, though, and we sometimes forget, is that as he's advancing into Italy, meeting no opposition whatsoever at first, with a very small force of troops, he's still sending letters back and forth saying, look, can't we talk about this? And it then comes down and then, Pompey, will you meet me in person? Can we actually discuss this? So part of this is obviously a pose. It's trying to seem as reasonable as possible. But Caesar is clearly aware that there are lots of people who just don't want a civil war, whatever they feel about him, and only a minority that really hate him. He declares early on that you can be neutral. I will only treat as an enemy someone who is fighting me. Whereas the other side have already said that if you're not for us, you're against us. So there are a lot of people who are trying just to keep quiet and not get involved because they don't see they've got any stake in this. Pompey's allies won't let him go and meet Caesar in person, I suspect because they don't trust him. A, because it would have been more sensible and for the general good to have cut a deal, but also this is his old friend. This is weirdly his father-in-law, but they have got on well. And Caesar, again, is notoriously charming. He is a very convincing individual when he's there. So he's not allowed to do that, and he's not prepared to fight a war, so they end up retreating, abandoning Italy. He goes off to raise a bigger army in Greece, and the civil war develops. But it's, even when Caesar's crossed the Rubicon, I mean, for us and for the, proverbially, it's when you've burnt your bridges, you've reached the point of no return. It probably wasn't actually at the time because they were still trying to negotiate. It's almost like raising the stakes again, saying, well, you don't think I'm serious. Look, I am serious. I will fight over this. So can't we just talk about it? Can't we settle it? But then again, that's seen as, well, he's now a rebel. They passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, basically a law that suspends all others' laws and allows, the magistrates, the leaders of the Republic, to do whatever is necessary to save the Republic, declaring a state of emergency. And it's a measure they've invoked on several occasions over the last 100 years. It's always caused problems because, like any political system, after it's been done and after the crisis, people look at it and say, well, was that really a crisis? Did you just get rid of some people you didn't like? And did you go too far? So it's an issue that's been raised repeatedly.
There's so many aspects to this that I'm curious about. Maybe a part of me feels for Caesar. Does he really want peace? Does he really want to try and make things right? He does not want this. But at the same time, there's a part of him that's saying, I'm going to the top. You don't understand. My goals are going to do whatever is necessary in order to accomplish the goals and to get the respect I deserve. He just spent, what, was it 6 years in Gaul, like fighting? And I can't
nearly
remember
10.
how long.
Nearly
10
yeah.
doing all these accomplishments, and now they want to strip him. That's at least the portrayal I got from the show on Rome, which I know we can't, but it's like, dude, I did all this stuff.
Yeah.
He seems like they portray him as a peaceful guy, like he's trying to even one of the kings of Gaul come up, right? And he shows him peace, he shows him respect, as long as the guy, bows down and whatnot. I don't know what's true, what's not, because I watched the show, but I'm listening to your book. And I'm just thinking of Caesar as a man who has extremely high goals and aspirations, but also really has intuitions. Like, I feel like myself in this, where it's like, I don't know, there are people that I would say in my life I've had that are enemies, right? And at the moment I might be hard, but I don't stay hard on them forever. There's a sense in which I'm like looking for mercy. I really do want to see peace happen. Whereas some men, seemingly like Pompey or maybe Crassus or someone like that, seem like they're thicker skinned and they can hold to that for so much longer and not necessarily need to make the reconciliation happen in order to feel like they're in sync, their equilibrium is on point for their life. I don't know. What is your read on him as a human from this? They
are flesh and blood human beings, all of them. And it's absolutely wrong to remove that. Yes, we don't know them as well. We don't have, their sort of private diaries or the equivalent of that, but they're people. And they clearly, Pompey, as I say, I don't think either side was convinced the other would push it to the brink. They just keep feeling, if we show we're serious, he'll back down. And they're thinking that way. Clearly, Cato loathes Caesar. And I think Cato is a man who is trying to live up to the famous ancestor and the stern, old-fashioned Roman virtue. He takes his philosophy, his stoicism, incredibly seriously and wants to be seen as the virtuous man, the perfect Roman, in part because that's his brand. That's how he's got popular, famous, tried to get elected. I think he feels he's seen past the Caesar charm. And when you have these charismatic individuals, the ones who do that really hate them because they can't understand why they keep winning other people over. And of course, it doesn't help that this is the man who's been sleeping with your sister on and off, who's married to somebody else. So for all his virtue, but you have to look and think in a logical way. Actually, Caesar has gone off on these campaigns and has been given powers legally. He's done, by Roman standards, the right thing. Rome has benefited from this. What's the example you want to set? If the Republic's functioning properly, shouldn't this man just come back to a continuing political career? But, bear in mind, he's in his mid-50s already. He's not going to be around forever. He won't dominate forever. This is not, yes, he might be consul a second time, maybe even a third if he can live that long. But how does that really distort the Republic in a way that makes it worth the risk of going to civil war and then the reality of civil war? And
if I may chime in on this point, though, would you say, so here he is, he's on the other side of the Rubicon. There's stuff going on between him and Pompey. He wants to meet him. He says so in his letters, like you say. At home, they're voting, don't you do this. Drop your weapons. Everyone disregard your armies. Come home. But is there already, so just so I understand this correctly, historically, Caesar's already getting notified that he's being charged, or is he already being notified that he's not going to be in his political position? And so now he's not letting this go. Like, someone's going to have to forfeit and someone's going to have to give, but there is no giving on any side, it seems.
The key thing is that he wants to stay in his command in Gaul, which was originally voted for 5 years, then extended to 10, until the autumn when there'll be an election. So he can stand for election, get elected to consul, celebrate his triumph through Rome, go straight into political office, never be a private citizen. One of the arguments is, when does his command actually end? Because when did it start? And there is a legal bickering over that. He's saying, well, it's very clear it ends, the end of this coming year, end of 49, because it started in beginning of 58. His opponents are saying, well, actually, part of it, Transalpine Gaul, was given to you not by the vote of the people, by a law, but by the Senate, and because it's current governor happened to die, and they thought, well, it makes sense to tack that on. So there's whole arguments about when his soldiers are due for their demobilization, and so he basically wants to prolong things or come back with the clear security. He wants the legal right to stand for the consulship without having to come into the city. Now, Pompey has done just this when he became consul back for 70 BC. As a Crassus, he'd come back from fighting in Spain. Crassus had just defeated Spartacus in a campaign where Caesar may have served. So again, nothing he's asking for is unprecedented. Nothing is illegal. The law states you've got to wait 10 years between consulships. He's doing exactly that. So, but people are interpreting it again. They're trying to look at the law and saying, well, maybe we could say you're not quite. So it comes, so he can see that's going, but he's not being charged with anything. He wants the assurance he can be in office until he stands for election and then go straight into the next consul. He's never a private citizen. They won't give him that reassurance. And Pompey has already started raising some troops. So it's part of it's this whole, they're sort of glaring at each other across the table and who's going to blink first. It's that time. And then they're convinced that if I just hold firm, he'll back down.
So what caused, in your best guess, what made Caesar go, enough, bringing my army, we're coming home, I'm taking full power, full control, and he's still trying to play nice guy in the meantime, it seems, while still doing this full-blown, bringing his troops into Rome. You can see it as attack, right, from the Senate's point of view. What causes that? And like, the outcome, of course, you go into a lot of this in your book, but if you don't mind painting some of this for our viewers, what in the world do we do from here? I mean, this is the start of, he keeps wanting to deny he's a king, but like he's kind of being pushed into this position where he's ultimately usurping all power now, correct?
Yes, I mean, it's, again, there's this hope in the early weeks and months of the Civil War they can still sort it out. Because again, there's no reason to believe that Caesar wouldn't have been happy with the second consulship, all the glory of that. That's a rare thing. And then another command. And there is a big command for him to do, because just a few years ago, Crassus, their other ally, has got killed by the Parthians, has provoked a war with Parthia. The Parthians since then have invaded Syria, got as far as Antioch, been fighting there. And everyone's been talking for years that we need to send a big army and a good commander out to deal with the Parthians because our province is under threat. But they're so preoccupied with the disputes between Caesar-Pompey and that they don't do it. So they just let this problem go on. Yeah, an interesting thing, Cassius, the man who will, with Brutus, lead the conspiracy against Caesar, is left, because he was Crassus's deputy, he's left as effective governor in Syria for about 2 years, when he's far too junior for this post, but they just can't be bothered to send anybody else out to do it. They are so focused elsewhere. So it's showing how government has stopped functioning. And I think Caesar sees himself as, well, I've done all the right things. I've earned this. I've done this for the good of the state. Why should I not get the credit? Now, what have I done just because some people don't like me or are jealous of this? But again, the Civil War happens. He has to win it. He's good at the fighting part of it, as he tends to be. He makes himself dictator because, again, he has these brief visits to Rome where he's got to get things functioning. He tries to get his sort of own Senate working. It only does to a limited degree because people are trying to keep out of this if they can. Others have gone off to join the Pompeians. He's fighting it and he's gaining more power. And then eventually, because the Pompeians keep fighting him, then he assumes more and more power. There isn't a way of getting back to normal. And it comes back to, he fights against Pompey in Greece, defeats him. Before that, he's been to Spain. He's overrun Spain. He's sent another army to Sicily and then North Africa. After he's defeated Pompey, he chases him to Egypt. He gets caught up in Egypt's own civil war, has the affair with Cleopatra. While he's there, while he stays there, and he does take a bit of a holiday and a cruise along the Nile, Cato and others have rebuilt another army to oppose him in North Africa, so you get more civil war. Part of your eastern province has been invaded, you've got to deal with that. Even when you've won in Africa, one of Pompey's sons goes and raises a new army in Spain. So the last part of Caesar's life is dominated by war and battle. And that's from when he goes to Gaul onwards and through the Civil War. So he's trying to sort of patch things up, make the state function, giving himself these extraordinary powers with the precedent of Sulla, but doing the exact opposite to Sulla, in that Sulla slaughtered all his enemies and stole their property. Caesar pardons everybody. Even sometimes when they fought against him a second time, they still get pardons. And somebody like Cato kills himself rather than accept Caesar's clemency just because he doesn't believe Caesar should have the right to be clement to him. He basically, after trying to stab himself in the stomach and failing, they sew up his wounds. His son brings in a surgeon to tend him, and then once he's alone, Cato rips the stitches open, pulls out his own entrails, dies in spectacularly gruesome manner, just to prove that one Roman should not have the power to pardon another Roman. It's a very strange viewpoint, but it's part of this path of absolutely strict virtue. This is what I believe. This is what I'm going to do. So they won't quit. They keep fighting him, even though he isn't the tyrant. He isn't massacring people. He's not doing these things. But he then tries to get the state working again using these extraordinary powers. And there's a sense of rush about it all. 46 BC it's about 445 days long because he adds months to the year so that he can bring in the new Julian calendar and try and get it starting in the right season. But it's about making everything work, make the courts work, make the calendar work, make public business work. Cicero, tells us in one letter, he's most surprised to receive a letter of thanks from a community in the provinces saying that, we're so glad you voted to approve our appeal on this or the other. And Cicero said, there wasn't a meeting of the Senate that day. I wasn't there. Caesar simply presented it as a template of this is how it should be done properly. And then, sign off on that one, send it off, make the decision. Now, you could have waited, but there's such a backlog of work. So people are not really objecting, even the conspirators, to what Caesar does. The objection is that one man has the power to do it, and that's not how Rome should work. So it becomes this difficult thing where it's very hard for him to please everybody, to do anything. Whatever he does, he's going to be criticized, because deep down, the Roman aristocracy believed that no one man or even one group should have permanent supreme power. And Caesar blatantly has that. The fact that he's using it for the common good is all very well. He just shouldn't have it. He shouldn't be able to do this.
Gosh, it just seems it's like sawing the limb off that we're all sitting on in a way. It feels like Caesar was assassinated by men who believed they were saving the Republic, as you just described. With the benefit of hindsight, though, was the Republic actually salvageable at that point? Or had the system already broken down beyond repair, according to your best guess?
It's certainly in a bad state. I mean, you've only got to look at from 133 BC, so not quite 100 years before Caesar's assassination in 44, is the first time in sort of, the recent sort of modern Roman history, as it were, that politics turns violent, when a tribune of the plebs is trying to get elected for another year and his cousin comes along, leads a mob, and they stoves in his head with a chair leg. From then on, violence comes into politics to the point where in 88 BC, you get Sulla leading his legions on the city of Rome itself because he feels, says his opponents have wronged him. Once politics turns violent, it is very hard to step back. I mean, historians always look at precedents. And of course, we can trace through because we're going to an end result if we know what's happened. So we see the things that seem to link to that and lead towards it. They may, we focus on those. But it is a lot of any political system relies upon everybody sticking to the rules, the sort of traditions of what you should do, not just the very strict, legally defined, this is what I can do, but how should I behave? How should I treat my opponents? How should I treat voters? How should I, to what extent, yes, I can manipulate the truth to favor me, but to what extent can I blatantly lie? Can I do anything? Once any of those things are done, it's always easier to do them a second time. And once politics becomes violent, everybody is thinking, this is a reality. All the people who are major figures in Caesar's generation have lived through the earlier civil war. They remember the bodies floating down the River Tiber. They remember the heads nailed up to the speaker's platform. They know that can happen. That's reality. So you're dealing with a political world where you know that your opponent might decide to try and kill you, to use force against you. There is a great temptation in that then to say, well, I'll get in first and do that. So the Republic hasn't worked. Whether it is irredeemable at this point, I wonder sometimes if Caesar was their best chance. Because if Caesar had gone on doing what he was doing, trying to get things back to normal, trying to get things running again and not been murdered, Even he's supposed to say that, well, people like Brutus, they can wait for my scalp, the world will be worse off. I've lived long enough for glory, for reputation. I don't need to do anything. I'm tired of life, but I'm just getting on with the job. And if you kill me, there'll just be another civil war, which of course there is. If he'd lived on, again, what was the worst he could have done? He's 56 at this point. Romans don't tend to have very, very long lives, unlike Macedonians and some Greeks who, get into this, still active in their 80s and 90s. Maybe he's got another consulship, maybe a third, but by that time, he's probably not going to be around too much. He's not at this point making any, with hindsight, we know the man who will become Caesar Augustus is going to be the principal heir of Caesar's will. We don't know whether that was public knowledge or not when Caesar's alive. He's going to get himself retrospectively adopted by Caesar and call himself son of Caesar. He's going to get Caesar deified, so he's not just son of Caesar, he's son of the divine Julius. And he's going to be the first emperor of a system that will last for centuries. And that's why the name Caesar becomes the Kaiser, the Tsar, this sort of name symbolic of power almost. But at the time, nobody knows that's going to happen. So if Caesar had just done that, would things have gone back to normal? He claims Sulla was politically illiterate for resigning from the dictatorship, that maybe he needed somebody to guide the state. But who knows? It's again, we have to deal with what really happened. The striking thing is that Brutus and Cassius, they stab Caesar, they run out, and just as they do in Shakespeare, peace, freedom, liberty, tyranny is dead. They're proclaiming liberty, the restoration of proper state affairs, the proper republic. And it goes down like a lead balloon. Most of the population don't care. And when you have Mark Antony delivering the funeral speech to Caesar, not only does that very quickly rally a mob, most people don't want another civil war. And the liberty that Brutus and Cassius proclaim is very much the liberty for the aristocracy to squeeze the provinces for every penny they can get and to be in charge and monopolize political office. And to his credit, sincere or not, Caesar has continually raised the rights of other groups within society, including the provincials. Yes, he's conquered Gaul, but he's also passed law to restrict what governors could do. And he's championed several causes. Yeah.
And the Gauls could become citizens, correct?
Yeah.
I mean,
he's put Gauls in the Senate. So he's done, again, is that because he thinks that's the popular thing to do that will win him support? But you have this striking image of when he's been cremated in the Forum, and you can go there today you see the Temple of the Divine Julius, that sort of very small structure, but that's the site where he was buried. He wasn't supposed to be, because you're not supposed to be killed or actually buried, or the funeral itself to take place inside the city. It's just the preparations for it and the orations. Later on, people are supposed to be coming, and it's described as all the poorer people are coming. The Jewish population of Rome is coming, and they're throwing things onto the pyre. They're lamenting someone that they felt looked after the wider interests. So this is someone who clearly has a very broad appeal beyond the elite. So you have to think, maybe this person is doing better. And in the end, the stability will only return when you do get one man in charge. So I think once Caesar is murdered, there is no prospect of a republic being restored. But it's probably difficult. But I think in a weird way, he may have been their best chance, even though in other respects, he did as much or more than anybody to destroy it by being willing to fight that civil war to protect his own reputation. Again, you could say, well, why should he accept retirement? Why should he accept political extinction when he's done nothing wrong by Roman standards? On the other hand, if he had, then there would probably have been moves to get rid of Pompey. There's the sense that Pompey is less dangerous, less politically savvy, but it isn't an easy answer. And we come back to this point that most, even of the aristocracy, just didn't want a civil war, didn't feel this was necessary.
So for our audience that studies the development of religion in the ancient world, Caesar was deified after his death. And that deification became a political tool for Augustus, of course. And we're going to have to, of course, dive into this at some point, because that's a whole nother can of worms. How did the mechanics of turning a man into a god actually work in Roman culture? And how serious did people take it?
It's a hard thing to answer. I mean, there's elements of very ancient ritual, and you go to the time, and they actually did this not too bad in the HBO Rome series, where on the day of the triumph, a Roman commander, his face was painted terracotta red, which was like the terracotta statues of Jupiter. And he wore the regalia and he received the adulation of a god. But you have, of course, classically the slave standing behind him, holding the laurel wreath over his head and whispering, "Remember, you are mortal." But it's almost God for a day, or at least the sense of the divine thing. But beyond that, there's no tradition of the Romans deifying anyone. There are different traditions about Romulus, the semi-mythical founder of Rome, that either he ascended to heaven to join the gods, or that he was torn to pieces by senators and they couldn't find the body because there was not enough left of him. But this isn't a routine thing that Romans, later on in the imperial period, from Augustus onwards, following the precedent of Caesar, an emperor who's considered a good emperor, when they die, is automatically deified. Hence the, Vespasian's final words are supposed to be this grim joke, "I think I'm becoming a god."
Yeah.
Clearly didn't take it seriously. And there's that element of mockery. The deified Julius isn't, he's not like Jupiter. He's not like Venus. He's not, again, because we have this monotheistic assumption that there's God and there's humanity. And it's very simple. The polytheistic tradition, you've had people like Heracles, Hercules, who've sort of worked their way up, divine parent, but they end up as a demigod, a lesser god. You've got other gods who are considered to be significant in a particular area or about a particular thing, and those that, so we have
kind
to
of like
try
the
and
political system, like there's
almost
rank to it in a way.
So it's, yes, there is a cult, there are honors issued, but you also have that, again, more of a Greek tradition, the sort of the hero cult that you have of Hephaestion and people like this will be added to, where you revere someone as sort of more than a normal human, but they're still not quite a god. They're not considered they can do much for you in a sense. It's probably somewhere along those lines, but it is, as with so many of the things that Augustus does, especially early on in his life, it is staggeringly new. And it's hard to see, again, somebody like Caesar, who doesn't seem to have many religious scruples at all, it's hard to see them taking it that seriously. You don't get a sense of it spreading, that there is a message from the divine Caesar. It is simply a way of honoring someone. And it goes back to ideas of Alexander and others. It's partly this influence from the wider world where a lot of monarchies have had divine associations, or the sense of being somehow representative on earth of, and you could look at this as the pharaohs, you could look at this as the Persian kings, that sense they're almost an intermediary. They're the god's agent on earth. They're not strictly speaking a god. So there's all these ideas around them, but it is new. It's not within the Roman tradition. And later on, with Augustus being deified, the imperial cult become important. You can see these temples around it, but it's tempting just to see it as largely a political thing, in that it's often an excuse for the aristocracy of a province, of a city, to get together, to come together in association, show their loyalty to Rome, but also every year or so when they send a letter of thanks and a present to the current emperor to say, and by the way, we wouldn't mind if you could pay a bit of attention to us, or could you do this for us? It's as a way of keeping negotiations and communication open. So I think it's hard to, the cult of Caesar doesn't become a big thing. The cult of the Caesars, once, you've moved on from just Augustus and you've got to quite a few of them. On the other hand, you can find them in 3rd century AD, this place called Jura Europus out on the Euphrates, where you have the early synagogue, you've got the Christian baptistry, all these wall paintings. You have one of the papyri, a calendar that's probably from the military unit, the garrison there, that's commemorating the birthdays of various divine members of the imperial family and some of the others. And even weirdly, Germanicus, the nephew of Tiberius, who dies under mysterious circumstances during Tiberius's reign, they're still remembering his birthday, which is slightly weird. So I think some of these things, but it can be a little bit like festivals and saints' days and things that become just a holiday as part of the calendar. Most people tend to go for the political interpretation. Some will go and say that later on in the rule of the emperors, that if you're somebody living in, the countryside around Ephesus or somewhere like that, let alone out really in the sticks, the Roman emperor is so powerful that they must seem like this distant figure you never see and that they can rule on anything. I think that's a little bit too simplistic. I think you still realize that this is, okay, this is the big boss, but I don't think I certainly don't get much sense of a sort of active cult beyond a more formal thing that's associated with loyalty. Again, jumping on a bit, but you can look in the 3rd century AD, some of the insistence on sacrificing on behalf of the emperors as a sort of test of loyalty that then causes problems for the Christian community and leads to persecution and all this sort of thing. It's begun as very much a political thing. You may also be worried about this slightly sort of weird group that you feel is disturbing the balance of things, your relationship of the state with the gods, and that maybe I need to do something about that. But then again, that's a whole other very big issue and going on.
Yeah.
But I don't think with Caesar, I can't see a sense of it being something that people are very emotional about. In a sense, it's more just, it's the sort of honor. He really was a great man, so he's a bit more than human. But I don't think it's much more than that.
Well, it's interesting because my next question says there's a fascinating thread connecting Caesar's deification to early Christian ideas about divine figures. Augustus became son of the divine, Divi Filius, through Caesar's apotheosis. And that same language later appears in the New Testament applied to Jesus. So just throwing it out there, how important is it to understand Roman imperial theology when studying the rise of Christianity? I know you're not a Christian scholar or New Testament academic, but when scholars are seeing these relationships, and likely the authors themselves are probably someone who is their first language is Greek or Latin, or they know these languages like Mark, the Gospel of Mark or something. What do you think of that? How important do you think knowing about Roman imperial theology would be to someone who might be crafting I would call them legends about Jesus?
It's part of, I think you have to remember, it's not just theology, it's part of a whole imperial complex. And you're living in it. You are part of that empire. This is the day-to-day reality, and it affects everything. To the New Testament story of whose head is on the coin. This whole idea, you can recognize Caesar's head, that the idea that coinage you are using as a routine thing. You are part of this. You have, nearly all the cities of the Eastern Empire have changed their calendar under Augustus so that their year began to commemorate his birthday. And so it's a big deal. It's everywhere. And it's a little bit like language, which can, of course, influence patterns of thought. This is part of your world, and you will see how quickly something that is an expression that starts getting used in the media can catch on and then gets applied far more broadly, and ways of thinking about things. So I think you should always look at the context. And from the point of view, if you're just looking at straight ancient history, Gospel accounts, Acts in particular, are giving you views of that world from a very different perspective to the one you normally get. And it's about, what do you think about governors, authority figures, tax figures, soldiers even, that appear in various ways. So whatever conclusion you come to, whatever you choose to believe, these are written by people who expected others who knew that world to understand, to get what you meant when you're doing this, and that you're not representing something wildly artificial in the way that society works, in the way that states work, in the way that people behave. So it's all part of a broader thing, but the Roman context is vital. And one of the big problems we have is that, of course, we have this simplistic view of the Roman Empire that tends to think very much in terms of just directly administered Roman provinces. So when you're looking at the Herods and people like that and their regimes, one of the great problems we have is that we have so little real information as to how they did things. And we're often guessing and filling in lots of gaps with how the Romans do things, but they're part of the Roman system. The Romans consider them part of the empire. And you've got, Herod building a Sebastos, a city named after Augustus. So it's all part of, and also interacting with both the Roman imperial elite in various ways, but also elites in other provinces. It's the same way as that, the weird, I can't remember which of the Herods ends up in Leon, Lugdunum in Gaul. One of them gets thrown out, and eventually that's where he settles. And it's just this odd thought that this fella's there with his family, with his entourage, because basically the Romans, I can't remember whether it's Caligula or Claudius, finally just decides we can't trust you with anything, so please go here and live off in comfortable retirement as they do. In the same way you'll get, Germans and others, Parthian princes in Rome, living around the imperial family. Even to some extent, there's one dedicates temple or makes a dedication. So this world is a lot more linked than we tend to think. And I think the more you get a sense of that wider context, the easier it is to understand. And again, that doesn't necessarily validate or invalidate what you're saying, but what the text might be saying. But these are texts that people were meant to take seriously.
Right.
So what's described, whether you're saying that incident happened or that incident didn't, it isn't supposed to be a story of wild fantasy that this happens, this is how it does. When it comes to the mundane things, you're probably getting a view that's as good as you get. And a lot of it does fit with what you get from hints of papyri, from Apuleius or something like that, which is about the only other time you're getting that level view of society, because these are not written by members of the imperial elite. Right. That's which virtually all the other literature we've got, they're written by a Suetonius, who's secretary to the emperors in the imperial administration, is an equestrian. Plutarch, Appian, these are Roman citizens. Yes, they're Greeks, but of quite high standing. Cassius Dio's a senator. Tacitus, the same. Josephus, obviously big deal source-wise, but ends up living around the imperial household, and has started off pretty well off in his own province to start off with. So it's a very different social background, which affects the way they see things, the way they tell things. But yes, I think the more it's useful to get that context, because at the very least, it's influencing. It's also not just how perhaps the author is thinking, but what's the audience thinking? When you read some of those expressions, how do you interpret that? Now, that's a broader thing, because obviously everybody's going to bring part of themselves to it.
Yeah.
But
I'll tell you my
world.
Just my hunch, and I can't help this, because I think a lot of scholars live off of, probabilistic, that's what historians have to do. They make probabilities. But when I read these texts, I think people take the Gospels a bit too historically. A lot of times, in my opinion. That is not to say there isn't potentially memory behind them. I read them, and there's so much symbolism, there's so much repetition of Greco-Roman tropes, as well as scripture that they're quoting, and they're seeming to mimic. I can't help but imagine that there's some kind of I want to use the term propaganda. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean that in a simply, here they're being competitive, right? So you're going to craft a story that models in some way. And I think we anachronistically take this so religiously without the author's intent. We don't know who these anonymous authors were or who they're actually writing for or to. I think there's so many question marks, and there's a lot of work recently being done by, I call them classicist New Testament scholars. Robin Faith Walsh. There's a lot of other academics who think, like you said, these weren't written by elites. They were written by people who were educated, clearly, but they weren't elite status. And they aren't, these are scholars who think that they're using so many tropes and themes and elements in the literary world that show they know what they're doing with these texts. They're not just writing a mundane history of what happened, facts on the ground. And I can't help but think that some kind of propaganda for this Jesus character in these stories is happening. But, I think, and this is problematic, we've done the whole thing on Caesar. I'd like to get our next question, but I really want to have your comments on this before we move forward. There's so much coverage and we've lost so much, but notice how much detail you've gotten into. To me, it's unfortunate when we move to a character like Jesus, because for anonymous texts, written by people that tradition says later, I think there's a lot more problems trying to reconstruct someone like that and understand what they really did or who they were than it is anyone like Caesar or something like that. So if someone said, oh, we have more data, more historical evidence for the historical Jesus than we do the Caesars. I just can't imagine that being a flat out lie, in my view.
Well, in one sense, you've got 4 texts, 4 biographies as they're presented. So, whereas with Caesar, you have Suetonius, you've got Plutarch, and then you've got various histories, Appian, and then you get... The thing is, somebody like Caesar made a very clear impact on the political world of the time. Now, this is the first man whose head appears on coins, the first living Roman. This is the man who there are plenty of inscriptions. And Augustus, it's staggeringly more. There are images of Augustus everywhere. So that, again, to take the New Testament example, the probability was, if anybody did say, look at a coin whose head on it, is not that it would be the Emperor Tiberius, who's around when the story is set. It's actually probably Augustus, because so much was minted then that's in circulation. You make an impact because you're there and you're building things. You're setting up inscriptions. You're doing things. Somebody who is coming from, rural Galilee and doing stuff, you're not going to hear about them. This is the expectation. And the other thing is, the historian would look at a gospel text and say, well, I'd like to know more, precisely. When's this person born? What do they do? What do they do at this stage of their life? They're clearly not designed to do that. This is not the interest, the focus, to give a full account, day by day. And okay, biographies of Caesar focus on particular things. You get peculiarities. The first section of both Plutarch and Suetonius' biography of Caesar are missing. So we don't actually know which year Caesar was born in. It's probably 100 BC, but it might be 101 or 102. There are arguments. I think 100 makes sense. And we mostly come back to this because he's stands for consul in the autumn of 60 BC for 59. You're supposed to be 42. He seems to be 40. And then the explanation of this is because he's won this Corona Civica early on in his career, that perhaps people with this award, that's the sort of Congressional Medal of Honor, Victoria Cross equivalent, had this political right that they could stand a couple of years early, because everything else fits better for 100 BC, but we don't know. And that's deeply frustrating. Right. And there are writing, we don't know when Antony or Cleopatra was born precisely. We've got to guess. I would say I've put together as much as I could about Caesar, but the striking thing is, with many even really big names and politically significant figures from the Greco-Roman world, we don't know very much about them. And those sorts of details, and nearly always the accounts focus on the bit of their life where they're doing stuff. So you've got to reconstruct what sort of education did Caesar have from, well, what do we know about what Roman aristocrats round about this era? That's what they're doing. And guess what? Right. Which, of course, you don't get. There are no equivalent biographies of somebody else of a similar social background as Jesus. So right. Where's your comparison? What's the basis? Yeah. There are different things. I think you've got to be a little bit careful. And I was always deeply skeptical of, because this was brought in, it wasn't just for New and Old Testament studies, but also of classical literature, where they'd look at a text and say, because of the language that's used in this sentence, I think this is a later interpolation from later on. Now, I've written a lot of books now, and I'm not putting myself on, I don't think anybody's going to be reading my stuff in centuries to come. I can read things I wrote a few years ago, and it could have been written by somebody else. And I know there are times when there are expressions I use for an hour, for a day, for a week, again and again, and then never in the rest of my life. So I've never had much faith in that style of analysis wherever it's applied. So I think you've just got to say, this is what we've got. Approach it with the same way you would approach another source, right. Saying, well, this is when we think it's written, we're not sure by whom, this is what it's about, this is the knowledge. Compare when, generally speaking, you get elements of the Roman state impinging. Broadly speaking, it seems to work, I think particularly in Acts. On the other hand, there are clearly, I've studied the Roman army a lot. So if you look at, I can't remember offhand, is it Acts 10? It's when Peter is supposed to go to Caesarea, meets Cornelius, centurion of Gallic Italica.
Acts 10.
Cornelius is supposed to go down on the ground in front of Peter. Now, there is only one other case of a Roman centurion bowing down before anyone, and that's in a very dodgy 3rd century source, where somebody's accused of basically disobeying orders that will have them executed. Whether or not you want to see, this is a historical incident or not, the symbolism of that is that a Roman authority figure and somebody of considerable status is seen as bowing down before a Galilean fisherman. That means that the author is making a point.
Right.
But it's based around, this is how we understand who centurions are and what they're doing and what sort of status they are. The fellow is represented as having his own household. And it's, again, the name doesn't necessarily tell you whether or not he's a Roman citizen, because there are some people who are adopting Roman-style names at this point. And although when formed, the cohort was raised in Italy, this is more than a generation on. So, what's going on at this point? But there's a lot of stuff there that I think would actually, the more background you have in ancient history, you would approach differently. Right. Whatever conclusions you're coming to. I'm not, I think everybody should make up their own mind. But so it does, they actually do, certainly from my perspective, imperial administration, the military side, which I can say is my real field, they are written by somebody who understands how these things work, even if they're then turning it to make a point. But you wouldn't make that point unless you're assuming the audience knows, well, this is how things should normally be. So it's a context thing. I think these are all sources for this period. There was a province of Judea in the 1st century AD. There's a Roman army. There's a Roman empire. These things exist. People at this time wrote this stuff. How you understand it, the wider impression you get of that world, I think the more useful it will be. But it's difficult. You could argue that a lot of the stories that we can't help repeating about Caesar, the being captured by the pirate stuff, what on earth is the basis for that? But it's a heck of a good story. And, you wonder, is Caesar told this story or has it been invented later on? It's hard to tell. You can't prove so much of ancient history. We can't get too sort of to stand on a high horse about other things, because in general, and it's particularly difficult when you start to look at the provinces, you get the archaeology, not quite uniquely, but for Judea more than anywhere else, so for the Jewish community and then the Christian community around the world, you get other sources that you don't really get. Very limited extent in Egypt, though part of that is Jewish as well. You don't get for Roman Gaul. You don't get for Roman Cilicia. So this is a glimpse of something different. And the fact that it doesn't always tie up precisely with what's going on, we get from the sort of the central elite that's giving us our other view of the world. That might just be that you're looking you're looking at the same picture from a different angle. But there will be common ground. There will be where you express things. There will be ideas. There will be expressions, because these are all people, and they are using Greek in particular in an imperial context, in a trading context, in all of these things, in the local politics as well. That's part of life as well. So there's a lot that's this broader world that's there that I think is always worth remembering and studying. And the more you know of that, I think it would be of benefit. Obviously that's my take. I'm an ancient historian, it's what I do, but I think it's there, it's useful. But there are useful things that the historian can get from the Jewish, from the Christian sources as well. That again doesn't necessarily mean you've got to say, right, that's exactly what happened, but how does it fit? What does that tell us? What maybe are people thinking? And you've, again, as with everything else, look at it, estimate it, try and understand it, try and judge it. In the end, it will come down to everybody's sense of what is plausible.
Thank you so much. Back to Caesar, just as we are getting close to our near end here on this wonderful discussion on Caesar. You present a largely sympathetic portrait of Caesar in the book. What aspects of his character or decisions do you find most admirable? And where do you think he was genuinely reckless or morally indefensible?
It's very difficult. He's a hard man to pin down. And I use I think it's the conclusion, there's a quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, among others, about Napoleon, saying that when you've just decided this man was an absolute blackguard, you find out something really inspiring and good about him. And then when you think he's good, you find out he did something terrible. Caesar did some pretty nasty stuff. He does. He is ruthless. He is very self-centered. He is going there for his reputation, his achievement, his sense. I think he looks at his own talents and thinks, well, I'm really good at everything. I deserve to be at the top on merit. And why should I accept anything less? Which you can understand. But, there are times when perhaps maybe he could have stepped back and avoided the bloodshed, whether or not that was so good for him personally. I'm encouraged by the fact that he does champion some of these causes that you feel are real problems the Republic is facing. And one of the things that will change under Augustus is there is a significant improvement that builds on Caesar's work of the way that people in the provinces are treated by the Romans. Under the Republic, they are exploited far more easily because basically senators are governors and senators pass justice on senators. And, they're thinking, well, I might be next or my cousin might be next. So let's just be nice about this. Let's forget about it. They're only a load of foreigners anyway. If they didn't want this, they shouldn't have let themselves be conquered. It's that sort of mentality. So you get him doing that, and you get this strong sense that the Republic and its system is just not working. That the senatorial elite that are basically Sulla's men, they've been put there through a civil war. They don't know how to run things. And so I like all of that. I'm drawn to that. As I say, the charm bit, that's very impressive, but it's also slightly worrying. And you're thinking, well, am I just getting caught up in, this is just the Caesar charm, the Caesar myth, the Caesar reputation? So there are elements where he does things that do prove to be misjudged. He makes mistakes. There's the classic thing about the war commentaries that he shows how much of a genius he is by getting himself out of problems that he's created in the first place. I think that's a little unfair because he prepares as much as he can, but once he decides waiting around isn't going to gain me anything, he just goes bald-headed at a problem or an issue, and it trusts to his luck, and it nearly comes a cropper, but he gets away with it. And it comes back again, the probably apocryphal, but the comment about Napoleon and pointing generals and saying, I don't care what their talent is, are they lucky? And Caesar, this emphasis, the Romans were very open about this. Sulla called himself Sulla Felix, Sulla the Lucky. And Caesar talked about his fortuna, that, this good luck. And you get a sense as well that by the end of his life, he was wondering if that luck was running out. There's that sense of fatigue, of exhaustion. So I think he's the sort of man who wouldn't care two hoots what I think of him, and wouldn't want my opinion. So, and I think he just did what he did and was going to do it and liked to be liked because that was the easier way to get things done. But I don't think he was one of these people who was acting with a view to the dim and distant future as to how he would be thought of. I think he was just getting on with it. And he gives me the impression of the sort of man who just wanted to get on with things and get it done. And there's that restless energy of the dictatorship where he's just dealing with one problem after another and doesn't have time to finish a lot of it. But the sense of, okay, if I'm in charge, I'm going to do this. This is going to work. I am going to make things function so that they don't need me making a decision. I'm going to get the system going again. So I do admire that. I admire the practicality about it. But yeah, as I say, I don't think he'd care about me. So
Well, Caesar's story has been used by political leaders for 2,000 years to justify everything from monarchy to dictatorship to revolutionary action. What do you think people most commonly get wrong when they try to draw modern political lessons from his life?
Well, they think of him as the first emperor, which he wasn't really. And the name Caesar, as we said before, it becomes so famous because of Augustus. I think most cases, modern politicians don't have a classical education, so they don't really have any idea. They probably know Shakespeare. And of course, in Shakespeare, Caesar gets murdered in Act 3 of the play. So, he's only there for half the time. And it's really about Brutus. And the main thing they remember, there's perhaps that grim lesson that, Octavian, Augustus, call him what you will, Antony and others learned in that they said when they were marching on Rome, once they'd made an alliance, they made this proclamation that's saying, Caesar spared all of you when you fought against him and you murdered him. We're not going to do the same thing. We're not going to make the same mistake. So I think sometimes the lesson is, well, you can get murdered by those close to you, or betrayed. The political cartoonist, you will often see the modern figure dressed up with his head in a toga with either daggers in the back or about to happen. We're probably going to lose a prime minister here in Britain fairly soon. Again, they'll do that, but I think most people now, there isn't that great classical education isn't as important as it used to be. So I think people don't know. And of course, our political leaders are not military leaders in the same way, at least in the West. We've separated since the 17th century. Military leadership, you never do that while you're also a political leader. You might do it afterwards. You might become a politician. So there's a lot of differences. There's a lot there. I think, I don't know. As I say, I'm not sure. I suspect they just think, oh, well, if you have Caesar's self-confidence, you can brass your way through and get away with anything, and oh, I'm bound to win and all that sort of thing. But again, that's fine if you are a Caesar with that talent and that skill. But, and even he, of course, gets murdered, so it doesn't work indefinitely. So I don't know. I think they might talk about the idea of Caesar, and obviously, going back a little bit, you've got the Mussolinis and people like that who wanted to be Roman emperors, and you go to these Italian railway stations with these statues of gladiators that are still there from that period. It's all a bit strange and a bit delusional, but there is probably that, as with Napoleon, that dream of spectacular success that, well, I can do it. I can keep winning. I can rise to the top. So it's probably that. But again, they've got to look at the context of Caesar and his life if they want to understand it.
After writing about Caesar, you went on to write about Augustus, which I have the book here and we're going to have to cover at some point, who arguably finished what Caesar started. How did writing the Caesar biography reshape your understanding of what Augustus actually accomplished and what he inherited?
A lot of it, as I say, is the contrast that Augustus has much more time. He's the last man standing after a civil war. In a way, I see the three books. I've got Caesar, the Antony and Cleopatra, and Augustus as almost a trilogy that cover that period. There's some overlap, obviously we're covering the same events, but from different perspectives. And they give you a sense of what's going on in the world and why the Republic is tearing itself apart like this. It is a big deal. Augustus turns the name Caesar and the idea of Caesar into something different. There is, however, there's this odd scholarly assumption that he distances himself from Caesar once he becomes successful, in the sense that you don't get a lot of talk after the Civil War of Caesar anymore. And they're almost saying, well, it comes back to this idea, well, Caesar got murdered, didn't he? Caesar crossed the Rubicon, didn't he? Whereas there's a comment that the historian Livy in a lost book praised Pompey and also questioned whether or not it was a good thing that's for the world that Caesar was born. We only have just a mention that he did that. We don't know what conclusion he came to, and he might have actually said, yes, it was a good idea. The thing I think they all miss from this is because to avoid confusion, we call Caesar's great nephew Octavian until he becomes Augustus. We avoid calling him Caesar because that would be confusing with Julius Caesar. But in fact, he is Gaius Julius Caesar, son of the divine Julius, Divi Filius you were talking about earlier, and then later Caesar Augustus. So he didn't have to remind people of his connection with Julius Caesar because it's there all the time. I think the fact that he invokes other people, other Republican figures become important and are celebrated, that's just added on. You've already got Caesar. So I think Caesar is probably more important to Augustus' long-term success than we tend to imagine. But also, he goes on to do so much himself. He doesn't need anybody else's glory.
Gotcha. Okay, last two here. If Caesar had survived the Ides of March and lived another 20 years, how do you think Roman history unfolds differently? Would he have created the same kind of system Augustus eventually built?
I have to wonder and suspect not. I suspect he still believed more in the Republic than Augustus did, because Augustus had grown up seeing it as a shambles and seeing civil war. In terms of the empire, Caesar was planning to leave for a campaign on the Danube and then going against the Parthians. I don't see any sign, Cicero said, I don't think he ever would have returned. I don't see any sign of serious ill health. I don't see any sign of serious decline in ability, and the Parthians are not at their strongest at this point. So I wouldn't be surprised if, I don't think he would have conquered them, but I think he would have established a Roman frontier in a rather different way. That Augustus, who negotiates with them, so the boundary, because you've got to remember, you've got the Romans controlling places like Syria, Judea, and then the Parthians controlling Seleucia on the Tigris. They're sort of half of the real heart of the old Seleucid Empire that had existed for centuries, the Alexandrian, successor state. I wonder whether more of that would have ended up as Roman through what of Caesar. The Parthians would still have existed, still have had a powerful empire, but further to the east. I don't know. That's purely speculation. He was only planning to be away for 3 years, so he wasn't going to do a vast amount. He's not planning as long a campaign as in Gaul. But I wonder if actually he would have tried to create something more like a traditional republican government with elected magistrates and just hoped that if he lived another 15, 20 years, there would have been, a more talented generation that could have actually run things properly. The key thing to remember, he doesn't any longer have a child. He does not adopt the man who'll become Augustus during his lifetime. He simply makes him principal heir to his private estate in his will. So he isn't planning on an heir. And even if he'd chosen someone, how old's Augustus going to be? Caesar doesn't know that this lad is going to be a sort of very dangerous, precocious 19-year-old who can win a civil war. So I do wonder, there isn't any particular sense that Caesar is creating a permanent position of princeps in the same way that Augustus will, and they expect to have successors. But again, we just don't know. And there's so many people were busy writing of what Caesar would have done if only they hadn't killed him, or what he would have done if he'd been spared. Afterwards, it's so hard to know. Those last months of his life, they're poorly recorded. There's no letters from Cicero, probably because his correspondent Atticus may well have been involved to some degree with the assassination, at least supporting or favorable, or said something indiscreet that wouldn't have gone down well under Augustus when they're in circulation and published. So I suspect that it's so hard to know. And again, the thing to remember is he has very little time to plan. So don't know, but I suspect something different.
And what's one thing about Caesar that still genuinely surprises you, or that you wish more people understood about him?
I think actually it's that until he's just about 40, his career is very normal, very conventional. He's a flamboyant politician. He gets noticed. He gets involved in gossip. He does these spectacular things, but he follows the rules. This is not the career of somebody who is setting out to destroy the state, which is what a lot of the later sources are claiming. So I think the problem is, again, we know this is Caesar, and we know what's going to happen, and it is so hard to free yourself from that. In the same way, you look at the Persians and others who are, marshalling their armies to fight against Alexander the Great, and we're screaming out, "Don't do this. This is Alexander the Great. You're not going to win. This is not going to work." But again, people at the time didn't realize that. You don't know this is going to happen, and there are so many chances as well in the world that Caesar might not have lived as long as to do all these things. So I think it's the conventional element, the traditional element in so much of Caesar's early life into middle age. It's only later that things start to change and he becomes this radical figure. So that, I think, that's the biggest, not myth so much, but things people just don't realize.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy, I really appreciate your time. I can't tell you, this has been so fun as a historical lesson on Caesar. I can't wait to dive into this guy. Honestly, your book, your writing style, it's so fun, and it's easy to track along. You're really painting such a fun narrative that I'm like imagining and seeing it in my head, right? The long dressed, he's got the long. I see Caesar kind of looking like the pretty boy, who comes out there, and the other guys' girls can't help but turn their heads, kind of thing,
Yeah.
Like, I could see him being the asshole who walks in the room, and you can't hate him, but you can, but you can't. And anyway, I really, really have grown to appreciate Caesar more after listening to this. But and I also really grown to appreciate your work and what you've done in painting him. So I hope people will go check out the books and be on the lookout. Hopefully we can cover Augustus. I may need to get the other book before we do Augustus. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up?
No, not really. As I say, the aim in writing these books is that anyone who's interested enough to pick it up will be able to follow it, will be able to find it interesting. And I'm just trying to say, this stuff fascinates me. The more I learn, the more incredible it all seems, and the more dramatic, the more just, I want to know all the time. So if I can convey any of that, that's the aim. That's what I'm trying to do. So that's always the hope.
It shines through your writing. It's contagious. And I ask everyone, get addicted to Adrian Goldsworthy right now. Links are in the description. I'm pinning a comment at the top as well, so everybody can go to the Amazon. I'm going to make sure the link, it has all the books on Amazon listed, so you don't just have to get one. You may want to give this gift to your friends. I'm telling you, you really need to get this. So Adrian or Dr. Goldsworthy, until next time.
Yep.
Yeah, until next time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are MythVision.